Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third and final day of our policy workshop on protection in context of mixed movement, looking at key protection challenges along the central and western Mediterranean routes. We have now on the screen the visual notes from our second wrap-up session at the end of the day yesterday. So please, I would invite you to take a look at some of the key points raised by panelists and other participants in relation to protection in context of mixed movement, which was the major theme for both panels yesterday, the panel and the round table. And where a large part of our discussion focused was what was the responsibility of states, where can states perhaps do more, and what could civil society do as a bridge builder or as a gap filler. And in that, we looked at community liaison officers, or the potential for community liaisons, local solidarity networks, and more. We also discussed the issue of trust yesterday. It was a major theme throughout all of our discussions, building trust with a whole host of actors. And related to that, strengthening our relationships with allies within communities, but also ministries and all key stakeholder groups in the field of migration. I won't provide any other recap because I would very much like to kick off the discussions for today. We have now an agenda focused very much on what do we do with all of the insights that we discussed. So on the first day, where we looked at the role of particularly donors was one of the big topics that came up, and the second day we really featured states and civil society, as I just said. Today we're trying to move forward a lot of those recommendations and see how they can be operationalized, particularly through advocacy, but also regional policy processes. So today very much represents the day of action. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first keynote, or at least introduce our moderator to introduce our first keynote. Our moderator is Danielle Botti, who is the regional coordinator of the Mixed Migration Center for East Africa and Yemen, based in Nairobi. She has nearly 15 years of experience in the humanitarian and development sectors, focusing on advocacy and protection work with vulnerable groups. So Danielle, I'd like to kick it off directly to you, and hopefully we can use some of this extra time that we have for more discussions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ayla, and good morning to everyone. I'm really pleased to be part of this workshop, and I'm looking forward to another day of critical thinking on these important protection issues. I'm very pleased to kick off day 3 of this workshop by introducing a distinguished colleague, Laetitia, to speak on the human rights dimensions of migration from the Horn of Africa. Laetitia is the Horn of Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, and in this role, she's investigated conflict-related abuses, including abuses against children and IDPs in Somalia, and she's focused on issues of political repression, including mistreatment of political detainees in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Before joining Human Rights Watch, she worked with human rights defenders in East Africa and at UNHCR in Uganda. She holds a master's in international affairs from Sciences Po in Paris, specializing in human rights, and a bachelor's in history from University College of London. Laetitia, a warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to allow me to present today, but especially to take part in these important discussions. Human rights abuses, of course, continue to play a significant part, if not form the main driver for migration from the Horn of Africa along all the different routes. So there is no question that any improvement in protection along the routes needs to be linked to actions and policies within the countries of origin in the Horn of Africa. And that all international and regional actors need to make sure that they have a coherent approach in this regard. Actions that undermine the protection space in the country of origin, be it for nationals in terms of the human rights context, but also for migrants and refugees in terms of the rights of people on the move, will have a negative impact further down. So now I will speak to some of the key rights developments that have been, and I believe will continue to drive migration from the region. I'm going to focus my remarks on Ethiopia and Eritrea, but I'm very happy to address the situation in Somalia and even in Sudan in our discussions. So Ethiopia has experienced a deteriorating rights context and cycles of unaddressed security force abuses, but also intercommunal violence since late 2019. There have been a few turning points. Of course, now notably the outbreak of conflict in the Tigray region, but also unrest, criminal violence, and abusive security force responses in Oromia in October 2019, and more recently following the killing of the popular Oromo singer Hachalu Hundessa in June-July 2020. A lot of the people we spoke to in the course of our research into the aftermath of the killing of Hachalu Hundessa mentioned that they no longer felt safe in Ethiopia. And we were hearing this both from ethnic Amhara communities who are minorities in the Oromia region, but also from Oromos themselves. As you will be aware, Oromos have made up a very significant proportion of those who have been fleeing political repression, violence, but also lack of economic opportunities from Ethiopia for many years. In our work, we've repeatedly raised concerns that the government has been failing to tackle the root causes of a lot of this unrest and abuses, including a real lack of commitment to tackle past abuses, including those committed by the TPLF-led coalition for many years, but also abuses which have taken place in the course of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's administration. So the conflict in the Tigray region, therefore, needs to be seen as part of a broader deterioration in rights context, which is, of course, going to impact and influence people's decisions about their future in the country. So in terms of research into the impact of the conflict in Tigray on civilians, it's been very difficult, especially in the first few weeks of the fighting. Communications have been shut down largely until very recently in the region. So we traveled to Sudan to speak to refugees, predominantly from Western Tigray, which was affected by the first weeks of the fighting in particular. We've documented very serious abuses, some of which amount to war crimes, and we are now investigating similar reports in other parts of Tigray, in the north and in the central region, although involving other parties to the conflict. We've documented unlawful artillery strikes in populated areas in Western Tigray, but also in other towns, including strikes that hit civilian infrastructure, including houses in the regional capital, Mekelle. These strikes have resulted in civilian deaths, injuries, and also widespread displacement. A lot of the refugees we spoke to in Sudan had initially fled internally, only to be caught up again in fighting and then to flee into Sudan as a last resort. We've also been documenting both in Western Tigray, but in other parts, widespread looting and pillaging. In the West, this has predominantly been by the Amhara regional forces and a youth militia known as the Fano that took control of the towns alongside the Ethiopian federal forces. We are also currently investigating widespread looting and occupation, as well as destruction of farmland and agricultural produce in areas of operation of the Eritrean forces. The destruction, occupation, and also looting of hospitals and healthcare centers has also left those that are injured and in need of critical care really in a dire situation right now. Warring parties have also committed extrajudicial executions. So maybe a few reflections first and foremost on our interviews with refugees in Sudan, which I think are very relevant to the discussions today. Refugees we spoke to in Sudan repeatedly told us that they do not feel that they would be able to return home anytime soon. And we heard this both from young refugees, but also older refugees, many of whom had actually already been displaced into the same camp in Sudan in their youth. Be it because of the abuses that have been committed in the Tigray region, and notably, obviously, widespread looting, which has left many of the refugees we spoke to with very little, if nothing, to go back to. Be it the presence of Amhara regional forces and administrators in that region, but also a very strong sense of betrayal of the federal government. And so the refugees, by and large, said they didn't feel safe or welcome to return home. We interviewed a number of college students, some of whom would actually have graduated in 2020 had it not been both for COVID, but then the outbreak of fighting in Tigray. They clearly told us they would not stay in Sudan's refugee camps. As you can imagine, these are young people with dreams who need freedom, and obviously these incredibly remote camps with very little communication networks will only repress those needs. The trauma also amongst this population was palpable. I mean, this is something which MSF has been raising. They are working in the transit camp and also in the main refugee camp, and has repeatedly raised as a concern. And this is obviously an element which needs to be taken into account for actors engaging down the route and in Libya. These refugees really just saw their lives turned upside down. A lot of the people we spoke to said they were caught completely off guard. And another thing that was weighing very heavily on people's well-being was also massive separation from their loved ones, which was obviously made worse also by the communication shutdown, which meant they were not able to get an update and information on where those they've been separated from were. We are now also investigating events in the 2 Eritrean refugee camps that UNHCR has not had access to. Clearly, there have been 2 bouts of fighting in the camps between Eritrean forces and local community militia that occurred in and around the camps, in which refugees were killed and injured. A number of those injured were taken back to Eritrea by Eritrean forces. We are also trying to understand the whereabouts of a number of dozens of Eritrean refugees that were taken by Eritrean forces from the camps as well. We're also looking into widespread looting of the host community by Eritrean forces, which, as you can imagine, has contributed to significant tensions between the host community and the refugee community. So while the exact number of refugees living in the camp when the war broke out may be unknown, what is known is that thousands of refugees, and according to UNHCR, of course, around early 2020, 44% of whom were children, are currently in need of urgent assistance and protection. Many of the refugees I've spoken to so far, notably from the Hitsat refugee camp, spent too much without any assistance, and many of them described having to eat leaves, moringa leaves, in the camp. So, of course, in early 2020, we had already raised concerns about the Ethiopian government's shift in asylum policies, and notably its impact on unaccompanied minors. What was particularly worrying as well around this shift was the lack of transparency, including around plans for the Hitsat refugee camp, and the lack of consultation with affected communities, but also humanitarian actors. I mean, to conclude on Ethiopia, I think between 2018 and 2020, the international community was by and large silent about what we were warning was a deteriorating human rights context. And I think events in Ethiopia have shown once again very clearly that there must be an ongoing effort by the international community to push back on negative steps in terms of rights framework and the protection framework. I'll briefly turn to Eritrea now. Eritrea's government continues to subject its population to widespread forced labor, national conscription, impose restrictions on freedom of expression, opinion, and faith. Unfortunately, although since the peace agreement, the Eritrea's government and leadership has increased its regional and international diplomatic engagement, it has done so without improving the rights and the plight of its population. So as we all know, flight from Eritrea has continued. In 2019, we released a report which was looking at the impact of the government's indefinite national service system on the secondary education sector. This research was partly driven by the fact that we wanted to understand what was driving the high number of school students, both children and young adults, to flee Eritrea, along with the high number of teachers. So the research highlighted very clearly how the secondary school system is a key tool used by the government to channel young people into indefinite national service, starting by forcing all students in their final year of secondary school to attend schooling in a military camp and undergo military training. Military officials control and run this Sawa military camp and subject students to military-style discipline and ill treatment. As you can imagine, that is not a particularly conducive learning environment either. So some secondary school students intentionally fail classes so as not to end up in their final year of secondary school. Others drop out, but then live in fear of government roundups in which youth without student cards risk being sent directly into military training and service. So flight is often the only viable option to these young people. In September 2020, the government actually ignored its own COVID-19 restrictions on movement, its ban on public transport, and its school closures, and channeled thousands of school students once again into the Sawa military camp. The whole school system, as the civil service more broadly, is staffed by conscripts. Despite the government's stated commitment to education reform, instead of developing a pool of committed, well-trained career secondary school students, the government conscripts teachers. And unfortunately, in recent years, we have seen that there is no political will on the part of the government to really change this system. So of course, while the abuses faced by conscripted teachers may not be as severe as military conscripts or those in the construction service, for example, teachers are conscripted for indefinite service, given no choice about whether to teach, what or where to teach. Also, despite the fact that teachers have started to receive a salary in recent years, which wasn't the case in the past, this doesn't guarantee them an adequate standard of living. Young people actually repeatedly told us that seeing teachers who are absent, unmotivated, and many of them fleeing, undermine their own desire to learn, but also their hope for their future. Of course, trying to evade national service and this system of conscription continues to have a very heavy cost, with prisons still overcrowded with people escaping national service or seeking to flee the country. So ending this systemic repression will be key to shifting migration trends. Young Eritreans will continue to flee until they are free, not only from arbitrary detentions, but they feel that they can determine their future and have their basic rights respected. So international actors cannot support projects that could directly or indirectly contribute to the abusive system of forced labor in Eritrea. I will pass now just very briefly to Yemen and Saudi Arabia, because I think, again, in terms of the importance of making sure that the protection actions are holistic and not siloed from efforts in countries of origin, but also along other routes. While numbers have decreased since the pandemic, we continue to receive reports that Ethiopian migrants continue to arrive in Yemen and continue the harrowing journey on to Saudi Arabia. Last year, we investigated the forced expulsion with lethal force of thousands of Ethiopians by Houthis from the Yemeni border towards Saudi Arabia. Dozens of them were shot dead in April 2020. Those that survived ended up in what is the now very well documented horrific detention facilities in Saudi Arabia. We've repeatedly called on the Saudi authorities to end the arbitrary and abusive detention of thousands of Ethiopian migrants, to immediately improve conditions in these detention facilities and release those with particular protection concerns, including children. We've also been calling on them to ensure that immigration detention should be applied as a measure of last resort. So while we welcome the news that the Ethiopian government is currently facilitating returns, we have also been calling for adequate response in Ethiopia, both by the Ethiopian government, but also via earmarked international assistance for those who are returned to Ethiopia, many of whom obviously have critical assistance need. So far, not enough has been done in this regard. Their response should also address immediate needs, including medical care, psychosocial support, and shelter, but also so that there is enough money for voluntary returns and reintegration in their home areas. Now, maybe just to note here, though, that the returns of Tigrayans at present requires particular attention, given the ongoing conflict. And aid agencies really should be pushing to have access to returnees to assess their protection concerns. As research shows, people who have migrated once are likely to do so again, and once again highlighting the importance here of a holistic response and approach in terms of protection. So maybe just to conclude and to underline the message here, advocacy around refugee rights and protections needs to be ongoing and intricately linked to advocacy and engagement in the general rights situation. Compartmentalization of international actions and policies are not helpful. Ongoing efforts to raise, of course, awareness about the risks of abuse and violence along the migration routes are important. This comes up in our research throughout the routes and in different countries of origins as well. But without a significant improvement in the rights context in the Horn, which is closely linked to the lack of a future for young people's aspirations, freedoms, and where rights can be guaranteed, people from the region will continue to flee despite the risks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Laetitia. I think it brings to light quite a few of the issues that we have been talking about over the last few days, and really kind of brings a lens to the situation in East Africa and Yemen, as you mentioned toward the end of your presentation. We have a nice bit of time to open up discussion to the group, and while we kind of wait for the questions to start coming in, maybe I can just start with one or two. I think looking with an eye towards the rest of the day, when we're going to be talking about regional policy responses and advocacy efforts, I think you've done a really great job of providing that foundation of where the situation is in East Africa and how we can kind of look for, let's say, cross-regional kind of responses. When you spoke about how Human Rights Watch has been calling on Saudi authorities to bring attention to the protection needs of detained migrants, and in particular, release of vulnerable people. Can you speak a little bit more to that, and maybe to where you see that more support is needed, and where the international community and advocacy actors could better support those efforts?
Yes, absolutely. And as a caveat, I am, of course, more focused on the Horn than on Saudi Arabia. But I think we've seen a tiny bit of an opening, which we hadn't seen before, in terms of discussions on these issues. I mean, the report we put out last year was obviously not the first, documenting both the horrific abuses faced by the migrants en route, but also the realities in detentions in Saudi Arabia. And I think, unfortunately, till more recently, we were not having any traction. And so I think, in terms of what the calls are, I mean, as I explained, I mean, there are immediate needs of those who are in detention, but there is also a whole question around the framework in which migration and asylum is operating in Saudi Arabia. And I think on that side, I think there is still a significant push and effort which needs to happen. In terms of the immediate response, the whole question of ensuring that the detentions are not abusive is obviously where the focus needs to be in the short term, but needs to form part of an ongoing broader discussion about the protection space. So I think we hope that there can be an ongoing discussion around the immediate needs, on the release of, whether it be children, whether it be pregnant women, people with special needs inside the detention facilities. I think that is one area, again, where the discussion should continue. But then there is obviously the broader discussion around voluntary returns and how the voluntariness is assessed and happens and materializes, but also the response in country of origins. And I think, as we mentioned, since the report we released, it was in 2019 already, where there had been an uptake in deportations, and we were really trying to encourage both the Ethiopian government and the international community to put in place a response to those returns. I think we have seen some attempts on the part of the international community to provide very basic assistance to the returnees, especially on their initial return. We haven't seen many steps from the Ethiopian government side, and we also haven't yet seen a broader effort at the sort of voluntary reintegration of these migrants. And I think, again, that's where a lot of the effort needs to happen.
Thanks for that. And to the participant here, I think, Ayla, you have your hand raised.
Thanks very much, Danielle, and thank you so much, Laetitia, for your intervention. My question is about kind of how you adopt a roots-based approach. And what I mean by that is how are violations that take place outside of the Horn of Africa, farther along the central Mediterranean route, considered in your work? And how do you, or how should roots-based or cross-border advocacy take place over?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I mean, of course, we have over the years done a lot of work looking at the context in Libya as well, and in terms of engagement with our colleagues focused on Libya, we have tried to make sure that the factors driving migration from the Horn, but also potentially the very specific protection concerns, are also included within our Libya work. And so that comes to, I think, a discussion we will be having this afternoon, that the research we did on Eritrea, on trying to understand why so many children, students are fleeing the country was also in part a response to what our colleagues in Libya were seeing, what I've been seeing here in Italy for many years in terms of the profile of individuals from Eritrea who are arriving. And so I think it's, and could we do a better job? I think absolutely. But I think we definitely try and make sure that what we also, in terms of our own research and interviewing, I think one of the issues I found with the Eritrean refugees in particular is there is a very heavy weight both to what they have faced in country, and so also making sure that our research on conditions in Libya does not feed into or potentially re-traumatize this particularly vulnerable population as well. So I think both in terms of how we interview, the questions we ask, but also in terms of our recommendations for specific populations as well. This is some of the examples. But as I said, also in terms of the topics we choose to focus on in terms of our country research as well, is very much linked to what we are seeing along some of the migration routes.
Thanks, Laetitia. And just to, again, say to the audience, please feel free to raise your hand and either myself or Ayla will call on you. I just wanted to actually kind of go back to one of the points that you just made, Laetitia, around interviewing and doing these direct interviews with people that are suffering kind of human rights abuses along these migration journeys. And it's something that you had talked about in your presentation, and I know is quite key to the work of Human Rights Watch. This element of bringing in the voices of people on the move is also crucial to MMC's work, particularly through the Forum I data collection. With maybe to get a jump start on some of the advocacy panel that you're going to be leading later today on protection responses, can you speak to any lessons on how to best make sure that the messages of the people that you are interviewing, recognizing that you're doing so with a human rights lens, how can we highlight those voices better in some of these advocacy efforts, or really even in some of those policy responses, to make sure that the people's direct experience is actually feeding into these policy responses and advocacy efforts?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much the bread and butter of our work, that we feel very strongly that the voices of communities who are not always finding other channels of expression are heard. I mean, it is, maybe coming back to the whole discussion also on how we feed in our work along the route. I mean, so decisions around what issues to focus on. I mean, I have over the years interviewed a lot of Eritreans in Italy, and there have been obviously moments where I would have wanted to be able to also speak to their experience in Libya, but it became very clear for in many of those interviews that was just not something they could speak of at the time. It was and so making sure that, in your interviewing, even though sometimes that there are important parts of their story that need to be heard, making decisions about what can and cannot be discussed. I mean, I think there are different types of interviews, and you can see this in a context where you want to be able to pin down facts. It's a very different type of interview than where you give also the opportunity for the interviewer to express their feelings. And those are interviews that take time. And there are unfortunately contexts in which you cannot do that. And I think a lot of the interviewing which will take place in when individuals are on the move, but especially in contexts of movement which are particularly unsafe, it is going to be very difficult to really create a space in which someone can share the sort of experience which I think are the most powerful in terms of advocacy messaging. And so I think that's also a decision we have to make in terms of where we interview, what we discuss, but also what is feasible with different types of interviewing and research. But I do, I think a lot of, this was something I think I felt very strongly with the research I've just done in Sudan. We went into the camps in Sudan not really having a good sense of what had been happening in the Tigray region at all. The communications shutdown really meant that the space was very much dominated by both parties to the conflict and rhetoric and a kind of control over information that was coming out, but also stories mainly from the diaspora, which were small, individual stories, but which didn't really give a good picture. And I think it for me, there were, some of the issues I shared in my discussion today about this feeling of betrayal, this sense of complete surprise that this population was just caught completely off guard. I think a lot of these profound feelings were both a surprise to me, but really just came out from these interviews. And so I do, and I think these are powerful insights into the very human impact of what an abuse is. And I think sometimes, as we know, and the discussion on reporting on abuses in Libya will be very important today as well. I think there is, a lot of people are now blasé by big words and descriptions of the abuse per se, but I think a lot of these, that what that means for an individual to suddenly have to decide to flee their house, leaving their family behind, not knowing where their children were at the time when the town, Humera, the border town in the Tigray region, came under shelling, and those decisions, what that looks like, I think is the most powerful in terms of advocacy, because I think it also touches a range of actors and highlights again the importance of why protection needs to happen and why these issues are important. But it's hard, and it's not always easy. And I think you sometimes need to decide as an interviewer when discussing those is just too much for the interviewee as well. So these are constant decisions that we have to take in our work, knowing that they are the most powerful, but at times knowing that it's just not possible to get those stories given the context in which we're working in.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think it will it'll help spark the discussion later that for the panelists today, and I'm sure that these issues around advocacy and including voices and making sure that stakeholders are all being heard from will be addressed a little bit more in detail in the later panels for today. So I think unless there's any other questions, we can hand back to Ayla to kick off the first panel of the day. I do see, Georgia, did you have your hand up?
Yes, Danielle, but I'm also happy to, if Laetitia is going to be around for the rest of the day, then we can continue to talk kind of as issues come up.
Okay. And I did see another hand, but I think it's gone away just now. So
we can take two quick questions. Maybe we can ask both of the questions, and then Laetitia can respond to both, if that works.
Yeah, I can ask. Thanks very much for the really interesting presentation, Laetitia. I was wondering about how you were talking about the diaspora and how you interact with the diaspora and how you reconstruct narratives about what's happening in these places through interviewing and engagement with that population. Yeah, and about your experience. Obviously, the Eritrean diaspora is incredibly vocal and informed in different directions about what's going on. It can be hard, as in any situation, to filter what is speculation, well, particularly around what's happening in Tigray, where there's been so little information on the ground about what's been happening, to know what is credible material to act off, and in a context where information has been so inflammatory, to verify in order to publicize, really. Yeah, so I'd love to hear more of your reflections on that. Thank you.
Should I wait for the second question or go ahead?
Yeah, I think we can call on Manon Radosta, who has his hand raised.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll be brief. Thank you so much, Laetitia. So I'm Manon, I'm working with the Libya Angel Forum and will be participating in this afternoon's panel. I just wanted to quickly follow up on the interview part, as I do indeed believe that it's a very powerful advocacy basis, but it's always difficult to interview people who were confronted to human rights violations and to really make sure that we don't do harm to them by asking too many questions or too frequently. And I know that for operational organizations, so I'm going to speak about Libya as it is a context that I'm currently working on, but I'm sure it's also the case elsewhere. But one of the main difficulty when doing data collection and interview is to make sure that they're protected and know the services they can access if they need it. But at the same time, not to raise expectations as the results in an assistance they could or not receive. And there is this really big risk of interview fatigue, let's say, as they don't know how telling the story actually helps them concretely on the short term. So I was wondering how you navigate that as a human rights organization. I guess it's a bit, different from operational organizations, but at the core, the main issues are the same. Thank you.
Great. I mean, maybe to start with Georgia's question, I mean, I think, the diaspora from the Horn are obviously important stakeholders, and they are important stakeholders both to understand and for us to shape our work, our advocacy, but also obviously as sources of information. Now, I mean, as any contact or source of information, we never only have one source. And so obviously we are constantly receiving information from the diaspora, from different groups in the diaspora. And we use that as anything else, as one piece that we then have to go and corroborate, dig into, look for alternative communities, because it is a lot about communities at the moment, especially in Ethiopia. And so they are obviously a key stakeholder, an important one, but one amongst others. And I think, for our point of view, of course, eyewitnesses, direct testimony is our bread and butter. And so we never publicize or report on anything which we have received secondhand. But I think, at the moment, as you say, in an information blackout, it is often at times very difficult. I mean, it's an incredibly stressful and difficult context to work in as a researcher, because on the one hand, you are bombarded by information. On the other hand, as a researcher, you need to dig that information each time and not take anything as face value. So I think, on Ethiopia more generally, I would say slightly differently to Eritrea. Since 2018, we were trying to do much more in-country research, speaking to people inside the country, which, at times has been incredibly difficult. And I think, unfortunately, the context is not as conducive to that anymore. Speaking to the Tigray region, even though now certain towns have had a restoration of communication, people are very, very scared to talk. And I think this is also something we were feeling in our research more recently in the Oromia region as well. So, speaking to people in country is as much as possible what we are trying to do, but it is often very difficult as well. So coming to the question of where the diaspora fits into that, but I think it's obviously an ongoing discussion internally, and it's something, at times very complex, but is obviously a key part of the work at the moment on the region more broadly. But obviously, I mean, I think there are also, and I would say on Eritrea in the last few years, there have been some activists, young activists, who are doing really important work. And as you'll know, the work around the Sawa, our report on Sawa, that there is a coalition of young Eritreans in the diaspora who have also been campaigning around the ongoing link of military training and secondary school education in Sawa, who are doing really important work. So I think at times an organization like ours are also trying to amplify the important work that activists from the region are doing as well. So the engagement happens at different levels. I think on the research side, it is a bit more complicated at times, but I think, you know, in terms of making sure that perspectives of people from the country, but also perspectives of people from the country, but in the diaspora also heard is important. And when we can facilitate that as well, I think it is also a role for us to play. And I'd be interested to discuss this more. On the question of interview fatigue, I mean, I think, you know, obviously we do research. Our interviews are very different to the interviews journalists do. And I think, I mean, most recently, I would say in the research in Sudan, we don't arrive at the same moment that journalists arrive at the scene of recent fighting. So there is obviously the risk that once journalists have been, when we arrive, there is maybe at that point a bit of fatigue. I mean, we try as much as possible not to interview people who have already been interviewed. It is obviously difficult at times. I mean, but that is definitely something we do. If someone has been interviewed before, whether it be by journalists, whether it be by protection actors, we make sure at the beginning of such an interview that that they feel comfortable being interviewed again. A lot of our consent as a human rights organization and the discussion at the beginning of an interview is to be very clear about the limits of our work, to make very clear that we are not humanitarian actors, that we can make recommendations to hopefully influence humanitarian action, but we cannot guarantee that humanitarian actors or the international community will buy into our recommendations. So a lot of the initial part of an interview is explaining that. And I would say over the years, I mean, working in this region, I have felt that people tend to understand that. I think sometimes, and you can see that in the course of an interview, sometimes a question is made. I mean, I always ask interviewees towards the end about, do they have questions for us? Do they want to understand more about what will happen next? I mean, what we're trying to do, and I have to admit, for me, the most fulfilling part of the work I do, I mean, just last week, we released a report on Ethiopia, and we tried as much as possible to also send it to people we had interviewed, to send to translators we had worked with from the community. And I think for me, when I receive feedback of people I've spoken to about our work, and this feeling, I mean, again, on the Tigray conflict, a feeling of gratitude that we are raising awareness at a time where I think there's a lot of feeling of being completely abandoned by the international community is wonderful. So we try. It's not always possible. And as all of you know, I mean, I think especially when you're interviewing people on the move, it is often very difficult to feed back to people. But, we explain very clearly where they might hear of our work on the radio. I mean, I've worked on Somalia for years. I mean, a lot of our work gets picked up by BBC Somali service. I explain that there will be a time where you may hear the research coming out, but trying to limit expectations, and that's hard, and it doesn't always feel good, because of course you take a lot of time from people who don't have a lot of time, and that unfortunately it might not always bring concrete results, but I think a lot of the time people understand that, and of course I think operating in our region, I mean, again, coming back to the recent interviewing in Rakuba, the humanitarian response was, really at the beginning when we arrived, it was quite slow. There weren't a lot of services being provided, and the services that were in place were completely overwhelmed. And so the whole issue of referrals is very difficult. I think in the whole region we are working in, there are often questions. And so then you make decisions about, there are types of research. I mean, obvious is sometimes victims of torture or of sexual violence, that if you know that you cannot make a referral, it's a decision about not doing the research in the first place. And of course, at times that's difficult. We know what the advocacy scene is like. We know the types of issues that sometimes get people and the international community to move more than other, but that's just for me, the priority is making sure our research is ethical.
Thanks, Laetitia. I think some great food for thought and a great wrap up to your speech. Over to Ayla for next steps.
Thank you, Danielle. I'm very pleased to introduce our first panel this morning, which is on regional policy responses to mixed movement, moderated by Edward O'Dwyer. Eddie is a senior policy advisor at UNHCR at the Office of the Special Envoy for the Central Mediterranean. And I would just like to ask Eddie to unmute and turn on your video and please introduce your panel. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ayla. Good morning, everybody. I'm indeed very pleased to be moderating this panel. The title of our discussion today is Regional Policy Responses to Mixed Movement. So before introducing our panel, who I am very, very pleased to be able to introduce to you just in a minute, I'd like to give you a flavor for what this panel is going to, the papers that have been presented. I think they're super interesting papers, really. The first one is about the COVID response to North Africa. It looks at whether or not there was a concerted regional response. How were refugees and migrants taken account by governments in North Africa, and it looks at, well, is migration still looked at through the optic of security as opposed to other more pressing priorities at the moment. So that was I think you'll see that very interesting. The second is the whole. I think this paper takes us into the hotspots. A lot of very key hot debates in the European, African, not just Libyan context, but this is focused on Europe and Libya, and it goes to, again, the policies, the implementation of migration policies, asylum and migration policies in the time of COVID, and how has that impacted? And again, you see this message coming through as an opportunist, maybe position by the EU, but that's for you to decide upon. The third one is a very interesting one that looks at, maybe people didn't analyze correctly what happened with the Eritrean mixed movements. I mean, was it based on traditional thinking and this linear focus on this is the path out of Eritrea and these are the reasons why we all know? But it takes it into a more regional context and says, and by the way, did you consider this over here, this aspect of the regional context, and maybe that can so that's very interesting as well. And the last one is again, I think you'll find these papers extremely interesting, is cities and local governments, and how, as partners of the future, because of the increased urbanization in the world, but in the context of the Central Med, how can you avoid not including municipal authorities and local governments in your partnerships in trying to manage mixed movements? So now that's the flavor. I will go to the detail of our esteemed panel, and I'm very pleased to introduce our first paper. The paper will talk to state and Humanitarian Responses to Migration, Mobility and COVID-19, the Nexus Lessons from North Africa, by Professor Joe Viri, who is Director of the African Centre for Migration and Society at the University of Witwatersrand, and Nicholas Maple, postdoctoral researcher, again from the university, ACMS, and also Dr. Kuda Vanyara, postdoctoral researcher, ACMS, also from the same university. So I'll just leave it at that. I'll introduce the next presentation as we go. Over to you, Professor Viri. I believe you will start.
Hi, it's Nick. I'm going to start if that's okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, as you wish. Sorry.
No problem. Let me share my screen. Cool. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks to the organisers of this excellent workshop for inviting us to speak. My name is Nick Maple. I work as a researcher at ACMS in Johannesburg with my colleagues Joe and Kuda, who are also online today. The plan for our presentation is for me to briefly introduce our overall project, and then for Kuda to speak to some of our key findings in relation to North Africa. So our presentation is based on a study ACMS have been working on since October last year, entitled COVID-19 and Migration Governance in Africa. Near the end of last year, the Institute for Human Rights and Development in Africa, which is based in the Gambia, commissioned the study to look at the effect the COVID-19 pandemic has had on refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and IDPs on the continent. The principal objective of the study has been to conduct a detailed mapping exercise across the five regional economic communities on measures supportive of the condition of migrants, refugees, and other forced to place persons during this crisis.
Nick, sorry to interrupt you, but we're not seeing your full screen, and I think the order of the slides.
Oh no, sorry.
Nick, I think you just need to click on to start slideshow.
Hang on. Okay, sorry about this.
Or switch screen. I think that's all it is.
Is that better?
No, you know, at the bottom, go right down to the bottom next to where it says normal view on the toolbar at the bottom. In the bottom left, the other side. Down. Yeah, there. I think that should.
Is that it?
No, I think it's because it's on the other slide, but that's fine. We can see it like that. That's fine.
You can.
Yep. Is that okay?
You can actually close off the. If you hit the X at the top, alongside outline, you'll be able to close off the left column. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, if that's okay, I'm going to keep going. So sorry about that. So through this project, we've been attempting to identify good practice in the protection of these target populations and identify manifestations of discrimination, intolerance, xenophobia, and the ill treatment of migrants during our methodology. Due to the time constraints involved, the study is based on primary source and great literature, as well as virtual interviews with key stakeholders involved in migration governance on the continent. This has included officials from UN agencies, international NGOs, and civil society. In addition, some migrant leaders and government officials were also interviewed. Ultimately, we conducted research in 6 regions. Sorry, hang on. North Africa, the Horn, East, West, and Southern Africa, and the Indian Ocean Islands. Due to the limited time available and ethical considerations around face-to-face interviews during the pandemic, the decision was taken not to interview large numbers of migrants and refugees for this study. but we're more than happy to talk about methodology during the Q&A. So the current state of the study is that firstly, we've been engaging with the African Commission on Human Rights, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the ACHPR, through its special rapporteur on refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons and migrants in Africa, which resulted in my colleague, Professor Viri, recently presenting some of the initial findings at the 67th Ordinary Session of the ACHPR, essentially calling on African states to mainstream all forms of migration and migrant groups into their responses to COVID-19. Secondly, a draft report has been sent to an expert panel for review and feedback. As such, we're very much at the stage of finalizing the report, and so we'd very much welcome any feedback or suggestions you might have, either in the Q&A or please do get in touch later, as we'll leave our email addresses at the end. Finally, I should just flag that as research is based in South Africa and predominantly working on issues in Southern Africa, we're in no way purporting to be experts on migration in North Africa, but we do hope our findings will be of interest to this audience, and equally, we hope it'll open a dialogue with experts in this area, as the importance of comparative work across the continent seems increasingly urgent. Okay, I'll stop there and hand over to Kuda, who's going to set out 3 of our key findings from our overall study by drawing on some of the research he's conducted in North Africa. And I'll try and get the slides to work. Thanks, Kuda.
Thanks, Nick. And many thanks to the organizers of the workshop for inviting us. Maybe I would like to begin by stating that COVID-19 and state and humanitarian responses to it have in many ways highlighted the essential role of human mobility, not only in the North African context, but in the broader African continent. So using Libya as a case study, we sought to outline and understand the interaction of migrant vulnerability, immobility, and the COVID-19 pandemic in the North African regional context, drawing on key lessons about migration and health governance and protection that we learned from early responses to the pandemic. And our central argument is that despite the prevalence of mixed migration patterns in the region, state responses to COVID-19 do not adequately engage with migration and mobility. And I think that we see this in the lack of concerted regional response to COVID-19 in the region. And even though there is some bilateral cooperation, such as that between countries such as Tunisia and Libya, which has been instrumental in returning people stuck at the borders, but particularly at the early stages of lockdown restrictions to their countries, we see that there remains little in the way of regional initiatives responding to the effects of the pandemic, nor any multilateral network that consists explicitly of governments. And while humanitarian actors have put in place regional information sharing platforms to make evidence available to relevant government focal points, these in themselves may not be adequate in responding to the negative impact of lockdown restrictions on migrants and refugees, particularly as migrants continue to perceive migration as a security issue. So we highlight in this presentation 3 key areas that are on the slides that illustrate this perception. The first one being the increasing levels of migrant vulnerability and xenophobia in the region. We know that for refugees and migrants, the pandemic and its socioeconomic and political impacts have only exacerbated existing vulnerability, while adding new and overlapping ones due to mobility restrictions that lead to what some of our informants refer to as involuntary mobility due to related restrictions on movement. And as we may all know, Libya confirmed the first case of COVID-19 on 24 March, and the government responded, amongst other public health measures, with a national-wide curfew, travel mobility restrictions due to closure of airports and other points of entry along land borders and maritime boundaries. And also local authorities in certain cities implemented even stricter measures via certain municipal entry restrictions into their cities. not to mention the 10-day lockdown that was announced on 17 April. Overall, we note that these lockdowns impacted migrant livelihoods via the decline of the economy, which decreased job opportunities in sectors such as construction, trade, and agriculture that are primarily targeted by migrant workers. And also, we also observe connections between restrictions on mobility, particularly for irregular migrants who could no longer move to access basic services and livelihoods. And because they're already working in informal sectors where there are no guarantees to access opportunities on a daily basis, we see how COVID-19 constrained the migrants' potential for onward movement, either directly as a result of these restrictions or due to a loss of income required to fund that mobility. And where return to one's home country is not necessarily viable, as is often the case, bureaucratic measures in the country, such as fines for overstaying visas, have exacerbated the situation. And to sort of highlight this finding, we also observed how xenophobia, due to the perception that migrants are vectors of the virus, aggravated the already vulnerable status of migrants in the country. Second, we also observed the impact of the pandemic on health and access to healthcare services for these often hidden populations via restrictive public health measures against the pandemic, which negatively affected migrants in the region who depend on mobility to access these services, which was only compounded by restrictions on humanitarian activities that are key to providing migrants with livelihoods and access to other services. And also living conditions also play a role in sort of exacerbating the vulnerability because of the higher risk of infection in crowded accommodation arrangements, such as shared rooms for migrant workers, that make it difficult to maintain social distance. And this is a particular challenge for those being held in detention centers. And while organizations like IOM have been providing health services in these spaces, accessing them also remains difficult because of how the militia controls these facilities. The third and final point is how the pandemic is also providing an impetus for reinforcement of a securitization agenda, particularly as we see detrimental economies leading to increased migration, or at least a desire to seek livelihoods elsewhere. And we see this example in the example of how in early 2020, there were numerous meetings between North African and Southern European states to discuss recent increases in migration, with the Maltese and Italian governments, providing disembarkation in their ports, and Italy declaring its seaports unsafe because of COVID-19, and proclaiming that they would not authorize the landing of migrant rescue boats until the end of the crisis. And given the conditions in Libya, these measures did little to stop migrants from leaving, and which also leads to migrants using unsafe routes, and also avoiding certain public health oriented interventions that are meant to monitor and to trace certain contacts who are moving from one place to the other. And one thing that we've learned is that Libya increased its deportation procedures during 2020. For example, the IOM highlighted how more than 2.5 migrants were deported from Libya to Niger, Sudan, Chad, and Egypt in April. And we also came across incidences of migrants who tested positive, reportedly being taken to detention centers and being put in solitary confinement with others who were tested, who were tested positive. So migrants who tested positive were taken to detention centers and either put in solitary confinement or mixed with others who were tested positive. And all these measures appear to work against broader responses that should engage with connectedness of national economies, health, and broader mobility regimes. So to wrap up these findings, we can say that increasingly securitizing migration management only results in a growing population of irregular migrants who, owing to fear of arrest, detention, and deportation, are more likely to avoid and evade communicable disease responses with negative consequences for all. As research has shown that closing borders and attempting to make populations immobile does not stop all movement. Rather, movement continues but becomes more dangerous as those moving outside of regular channels are forced to take greater risks. And key areas of concerns in this regard include transit camps in Niger at the border with Libya and Algeria. I'll now hand back over to Nick to offer some concluding remarks. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter.
Colleagues, so just 2 minutes, please, because we have to
just, just 1 minute. It was very brief. I just wanted to end on some vaguely positive points that perhaps we could touch on in the Q&A. Just to say some of the broader themes from the overall report. We did find some pockets of good practice by states and the RECs in response to COVID. And we also looked at responses by UN agency and other agencies, and again, seeing some windows of opportunity for the future, including much more of a focus on localized responses. But yeah, we're happy to leave it there. And we'd obviously love to hear from others if you have any questions or comments. And we've left our email addresses. And once the report is finalized and published, we'll obviously share it on social media, etc. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to get myself back on screen again, but it seems I can't find the right button, but not to worry. Thank you very much. We'll hold questions on that very interesting. Colleagues, thank you for a very stimulating and informative presentation. If we could move right along, our second paper presentation today is on the theme of migration management in the time of COVID-19, EU policies and Libya. Sorry, I'm looking at this, and it's from Amira Marcus from the Libya, a team leader of the Mixed Migration Center of North Africa. So Amira, over to you, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Edward. I'm happy to be here, and thank you all for joining us. Please let me know if you cannot hear me well. I'm pleased to present my paper with MMC North Africa, which is about migration management at the time of COVID, about EU policies and Libya. It was commissioned by Friedrich Ebert Organization, and we finalized it in December 2020. To give a bit of an overview about the context that we're dealing with here, Libya has been in political instability since 2011, with an intensified conflict in and around the capital Tripoli since 2019, which has resolved in June 2020. So you can imagine how the situation was with the COVID outbreak throughout the world, and in Libya in March, with the already existing health weak system, which put the country at higher risk of spread of COVID. So indeed, this has worsened the conditions of migrants and refugees being already in a vulnerable state. And this has increased the need for them to migrate, seek protection, and improve their own conditions. And of course, this outweighed the risks involved in this journey to Europe. Also, to give a bit of an understanding about the differences between 2019 and 2020, if we look at the left, we see that the total numbers of migrants and refugees in Libya has dropped in 2020, which is of course related to the COVID restrictions and border closures in Libya. On the other hand, we noticed also an increase in the number of returns by Libyan Coast Guards to Libya compared with 2019, while also there was an increase in the number of arrivals to Italy from the coast of Libya to in the Mediterranean Sea. To go further into our topic, we tried to look closely at the EU member states' migration policies since the start of the pandemic. And first of all, we noticed that there was an absence of state-led search and rescue operations at sea. And this has led NGO rescue ships to actually take the lead and start rescuing stranded migrants and refugees in the Mediterranean. And because of the pandemic, many countries, starting with Germany, they started calling on those NGO rescue vessels to hold their operations. Also, Malta started declaring the ports unsafe because of the pandemic, in addition to Italy as well. And on the other hand, we also saw some incidents in which Malta used commercial boats to return migrants and refugees from Maltese waters to Libyan shores by the help of Libyan coast guards, in addition to Italy detaining NGO rescue ships 5 times in 2020 alone. And this has led us to another type of operations that was conducted in that year, which is done by private vessels. And again, they were also refused disembarkation in European ports. This leads us to the conclusion that is actually the pandemic being used to deter migration or not? And this was a concern raised by so many human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch. And this, I will lead you to think about this question as well, and we can discuss it further as we go in the discussion. On the other hand, we also looked at the evolution of migration policies along the Mediterranean crossing. We saw that in March 2020, which was at the start of the pandemic, Operation Sophia, which is an EU mission in the Mediterranean to dismantle smuggling business, it was established in 2015 and it was expired in March 2020. However, it was replaced at the same time that month by Operation Irini, which is a military mission by the EU to monitor the UN arms embargo in Libya, but at the same time, it has another focus to train Libyan coast guards and to also focus on dismantling the smuggling business in the region. On the other hand, at the same time, in April, we saw that EUBAM, the European Border Mission for Libya, with IOM, they both signed a new agreement with the Libyan government to help them with border control and security reform. Later in September, the European Commission has actually launched the new Pact on Migration and Asylum. And while it's still not clearly evident the impact that it has on the ground, but we've already spoken with a key informant from the EU Parliament, and she explained that the unspoken but foundational policy of keeping migrants out of Europe at any cost will be codified and given further energy with this pact. When we looked also further on the impact that COVID had on the policies, we saw that there was no policy change around Libyan borders and also on the content of migration policies. But instead, we saw some changes in the implementation on the ground. On the other hand, we also saw that EU member states have actually changed their policies, but it was mostly to comply with the new health procedures as a response to the pandemic. But again, they didn't guarantee the international protection to migrants and refugees who were stranded in the Mediterranean. And this makes us also think about the fact is COVID actually being used as a justification to further prevent arrivals to Europe or not, which was also what was suggested from one of the key informants, which is a researcher at State Watch. When we looked also at the migration management by Libyan authorities since COVID, we noticed that there were health protocols issued from the Ministry of Justice within the GNA government, including the release of 245 vulnerable migrants and refugees from several detention centers in the country. But again, when we spoke with humanitarian workers within INGOs and UN agencies, they were actually unaware of those procedures taken by authorities. And they were noting that these are actually individual decisions taken by managers of detention centers to utilize their own authority in the center that they actually run. So this makes us also think or reflect on the point that migration policies are actually remaining at higher levels, decision makers, between both Libyan authorities and EU actors, and do not necessarily trickle down to implementers on the ground. Sorry. Okay, so we also looked at the impact on migrants and refugees. We saw that there was a perceived increased risk of arbitrary arrest and detention since the COVID outbreak, and this was part of 200 surveyed migrants and refugees, and this was their perception. So, for example, we have 58% of the respondents have actually said that they strongly agree or agree with the increased risk of arbitrary arrest and detention since the start of COVID. And there was like a quote from a Ghanaian community leader saying that if a refugee or a migrant tests positive for COVID, he or she will be taken to a detention center. On the other hand, we also noticed that there was a tightened security in Libya at sea and across the route to Europe, which has impacted the duration of journey taken to reach the coast and to cross the sea to Europe. In addition to an increase in the cost of the journey, rising from $1,000 to $3,000 per person. Also, there was a suspension of IOM's voluntary humanitarian return program and UNHCR's evacuation and resettlement program from March until August 2020, which has also impacted the conditions of migrants and refugees in the country, which also made them stuck and couldn't be able to move forward with their journey or to return back to their countries. Looking also at the conditions inside detention centers, we saw no improvement inside the centers that are still running, and there were still continuous overcrowding, just like the situation before COVID. To sum up with the key recommendations, as this paper is mostly targeting EU and EU member states, we can start with encouraging them or recommending them to support the Libyan government to better respond to COVID especially for the fact that migrants and refugees being vulnerable themselves. So we wish that they can actually focus on that more, in addition to supporting humanitarian programs based on the need rather than directed at their own migration policies, and to cease providing any assistance contributing to interceptions and returns to Libya. On the other hand, we also wish to recommend for EU and Libyan authorities together to implement coherent policies aligned with the human rights standards and to provide alternatives to detention and reformulate Libyan law that uses detention as a policy to deter migration, in addition to engaging wider groups of stakeholders on discussions around the management of migration. For example, civil society activists or representatives from migrant and refugee communities in the country. And last but not least, to also recommend for INGOs and UN agencies to provide assistance for migrants and refugees, regardless their intentions to move onward with their journey and their intentions in general for migration, in addition to improving advocacy efforts to ensure human rights standards for migrants and refugees in Libya. I hope I'm still in time, and I'm looking forward for the discussion later on. Thank you.
Sorry, yes, you have time. I was muted. You have a few more minutes. Please go ahead. You're muted, I think.
Yes, sorry. I kind of summed it all, but just to give a better explanation of how we did this research, we actually interviewed Libyan officials, we interviewed European actors, both in Libya and in Europe, in addition to interviewing INGO actors and UN agencies who have over 6 years experience on the ground in Libya. And we interviewed community leaders from migrant and refugee communities with qualitative interviews, in addition to doing quantitative surveys for 200 migrants and refugees in more than 8 cities in the country, with targeting more than 25 nationalities in Libya. I guess that would be it from my side, and looking forward to see your comments also on the chat box and later on in the discussion. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Okay, so Amara, just at this stage, can you just go back over a little bit the area where you spoke about increasing security measures on land and at sea, and this whole idea of cost rising for dangerous journeys, and that whole area, just expand on that a little bit.
So this was what the interviewed migrants and refugees have noted down. Of course, they couldn't exactly link the tightened security in the country to COVID, but this was at the same time. So we thought it might be very important for us to mention here as well, and as a finding of our research. They said that it was hard for them to move around in the country. For example, if they're still crossing the borders, coming, let's say, to Sabha, and then usually the journey takes them from Sabha to Tripoli, few days, but now it actually takes them longer because there are more police checkpoints throughout the whole route inside the country itself. So for them to actually reach from border to the Libyan coast to cross to Europe, it takes them longer than before. And this was also the reason for the increase of the cost of the journey, because smugglers will be demanding for more money in order for them to make sure that the person is actually going to continue the journey with all of them. Yeah, I hope I answered your question, but please let me know if you have further questions.
Yeah, I mean, I do in terms of, so that's clear on the land piece. Now on the sea piece.
Okay, sure.
Your paper talks a little bit about search and rescue and state vessels and NGO vessels and private vessels, just a little bit on that.
So we also asked about this question, and we wanted first to understand the perception of migrants and refugees who are in Libya to know exactly what they know about migration policies in general. So this was one of our starting questions. And the majority of the surveyed 200 migrants.
Can you speak slowly, because I think the interpreters are
sorry.
Sure, sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of C, when we spoke to migrants and refugees, the 200 sampled within our research, they actually spoke, they were actually aware of migration policies. For example, they mentioned interceptions at sea. They mentioned that deportations are also something that like reflects the migration policies in Libya. They were also quite aware of the type of arrangements between EU and Libya. And this was also mentioned a lot during the questions when we asked them about their understanding and the perception in general. But to give a clear answer, I would say they didn't specify exactly, for example, if the police in the Mediterranean Sea are actually from Europe or from Libya, if the rescue operations are happening by NGO actors or by Libyan Coast Guards. So they couldn't differentiate exactly between the different actors. And that was a finding in itself, I would say, because we also asked about their source of information to such information at sea. And most of them didn't know exactly the differences between those actors.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you very much, Amra. Colleagues, before I go to the next presentation, I feel that if I don't do a summary of the first two now, I'm going to have difficulty at the end to do 4 at this rate of producing. So just very quickly, while we're still with Amra, just to recap on the points you made. I mean, you started by saying, the absence of state-led search and rescue, and whether or not the COVID is giving an opportunity to Europe to have a particular take on migration management. You spoke of the Sophie and the Irini, and how that has impacted the situation of the precariousness of refugees and migrants going across. And whereas yes, Irini is more focused on a military mission, the search and rescue of Sophie is gone, and that whole aspect is gone. And again, while Irini is focused on dismantling smuggling, then there's a question there how effective that is in its application. Also, the EU BAM and the border control management of the EU BAM agreements between the EU and Libya, and then which is an interesting statement, and we will hear more, I'm sure, about the pact, the European new pact on migration, as an unspoken policy to keep, to button the borders and keep migrants out and refugees out. So that's an interesting one. No policy changes per se in Libya, but there have been changes on the ground, and I won't go into all those details about the health. I think both yourself and the first presentation have spoken very well on those. But then again, you came back on the absence of search and rescue, and the increased security measures on land and at sea, and the aspects about the cost. The recommendations you make are very clear. So I won't go into those. Thank you very much, Amra. Can I just give a two minutes on the first one, on the first panel, in terms of so the first panel on the good practice. It looked at good practice in terms of trying to mainstream migration management or migration of asylum into COVID responses on a continental level, but the focus of this study is on North Africa. And the interesting point that at the 67th ordinary session of the ACHPR, the Human Rights, and through the Special Rapporteur, Madame Fadel, there was that message put out there that, you know, the continent should be looking at mainstreaming that. Now, how effective that has been is not clear, because the state responses appeared do not engage with migration and mobility. In fact, there had been some cooperation between Tunisia and Libya at the beginning. There was some information sharing, but little remains in terms of a concerted response to the issue. There's been an increase in vulnerabilities of migrants and xenophobia. The whole vulnerability and risk for migrants and refugees is exacerbated, and the strict measures imposed don't help that situation. But of course, then there is the virus as well alongside of that. The impact on livelihoods, access to services is clear, including health. But the whole optic of the controlling of the virus in terms of migration was seen through a security lens, and we've seen deportations and confinement of those who are sick in conditions that are not, putting people together in tight spaces who are sick is not the best medical practice, we're sure. So basically, the message is increased security measures increases a population of irregular, increases the irregular population and makes it more vulnerable. And closing borders has the same effect on that. So that's I think a summary of the first two presentations. So now, having just done that, and if I might, just to go back to the agenda and introduce the next. Right, so very pleased to introduce Dr. Georgia Cole, the Chancellor's Fellow from the School of Social and Political Sciences in the University of Edinburgh. And Georgia will talk to us today about policy, regions and migration routes. Where is the misalignment? So over to you, Georgia.
Great, thank you very much, Eddie. Is this going to work to show you? Oh, screen sharing isn't. Maybe I'm not able to screen share.
Colleagues, can you help with that, Ayla, Jim?
We certainly can. If you want to begin, Georgia, with just your video, and if you send us your presentation, then we can share it in the background for you.
Okay, let me. Sorry.
Otherwise, if you want, go to another panelist, and then you send it to us. We'll work on the tech in the background, and then we'll come back.
I don't want to put Janina on the spot.
We can go to the next.
Georgia, it's okay, I think. Leonel, what do you think?
If you're okay, I mean, while we're setting up, I think it's a good idea, Jay. If you're good to go.
Janina's voice.
Janina, is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you.
Georgia, are you okay? So we'll ask Janina to go, and then you can sort that technical problem out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Janina.
No problem.
Okay, so let me introduce Janina Sturner. She's a research fellow at the University of Nuremberg. And we have also Lionel Nyazamba, excuse me, sorry for the pronunciation, Migration Officer, United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG of Africa. Very interesting presentation here. Local authorities as allies in promoting protection frameworks for mobile urban populations. So over to you, Janina.
Thank you so much. So let's see if the screen sharing works here.
Yeah, that looks good.
Yes, can you see it like full screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. So good morning, everyone. As you have heard, I'm Janina, and I'm very glad to be here today together with my colleague and friend, Lionel Nzamba. And we are going to talk with all of you about the role of local authorities and the question whether and how they could become allies of civil society, the UNHCR, and other international organizations in promoting protection frameworks for mobile urban populations along migration routes. And this morning, we would like to start us all out with a governance paradox that more and more cities around the world are facing. And this governance paradox is related to increasing urbanization. So more and more migrants and refugees and IDPs are living in cities around the world. And the data from UNDESA and from the World Bank shows us that future urbanization, 90% of this urbanization is going to take place in Africa and in Asia. So African cities are more and more impacted by the direct and the indirect consequences of mixed migration movements. But not only by the movements, they're also impacted by national and international policies and strategies. And cities, and when we say cities, we understand local authorities and local governments. They're expected to cope with this urbanization. However, they have really limited resources, capacities, and also legal or political mandates to address questions of migration and displacement. And in this context, I'm always thinking of a conversation I had with a city representative from the city of Sfax in Tunisia, who really made the point that Sfax and other Tunisian cities, in the context of migration displacement, really only have two legal competencies, and this is issuing certificates of birth and of death. And he asked me this question that always stayed with me since. He asked, but what about the life of migrants and refugees, the life in between? And so for cities, in the context of increasing urbanization of migration and displacement, the lack of resources, of capacities, of legal competencies is a real issue. But there's another element that contributes to this governance paradox. And that's the fact that a lot of local authorities actually lack channels to feed their local knowledge, their local experience back into national or international policymaking processes. So cities really struggle to co-shape protection frameworks. Now, it's really important to us to emphasize that we're in no way saying that cities are necessarily more supportive of protection frameworks than national governments. And we do acknowledge that it's only a small number of African cities that are engaging on questions of migration and displacement so far. But of those, we can see that they have a pragmatic interest in ensuring social cohesion and urban development. And some of them, and we could mention Sousse and Sfax in Tunisia, or Rabat and Oujda in Morocco, there's city representatives there that have recognized that inclusive approaches are in the long run more sustainable for all residents than exclusionary short-term solutions like closing national borders, evicting certain parts of the city population. And so we argue that building on their municipal convening power and knowledge could hold potential for multi-stakeholder partnerships to strengthen protection frameworks along migration routes. So what are we going to do in the remaining 10 minutes? It's important to emphasize that in this presentation, we're taking a good practice perspective. So we're purposefully zooming in on cities that are willing to engage and interested to engage on questions of migration and displacement, to see what options there could be for context-specific small-scale coalitions of the willing. We're taking a multi-level view to focus on the role of cities, the possible role of cities in co-shaping local, national, and international protection frameworks. And finally, since we really believe that research should strive for real-world impact, we will close by presenting a couple of recommendations on multi-stakeholder and multi-level partnerships. And at this point, I will hand over to Lionel, who will look with us at how cities could contribute to protection frameworks. Lionel, over to you.
Thank you, Yanina, and thank you, everybody. I will make my speech in French. Donc, pour poursuivre ce que disait Yanina, nous savons que dans cette alliance à bâtir pour la promotion du cadre de protection des mouvements migratoires mixtes, les autorités locales africaines sont guidées par une approche basée sur deux éléments: assurer la cohésion sociale, mais aussi assurer le développement urbain. Et au niveau local, il faut savoir que l'intérêt des villes pour les droits des migrants et des réfugiés n'est pas récent. En dépit de l'absence d'un cadre légal qui permette l'action des villes, elles se sont fournies elles-mêmes des éléments pour pouvoir défendre les droits des migrants et des réfugiés. Nous avons eu à adopter une charte appelée la Charte des collectivités territoriales d'Afrique sur la migration, adoptée lors du sommet Africité, où les élus locaux ont clairement marqué leur parti pris pour le droit des migrants, car les migrants sont une force également pour le niveau local, mais aussi pour le niveau national et pour le développement des villes en général. Donc, ces villes-là se sont concentrées en fait sur la protection des migrants. Nous avons vu donc qu'il y a beaucoup d'effervescence autour de mouvements municipaux sur la protection des migrants, qui a donné beaucoup d'éléments qui ont favorisé des projets. Nous avons par exemple le projet MC2CM et nous voulons mettre en avant une initiative qui n'a pas eu suffisamment de vues, on va dire, au niveau international. Une initiative lancée par le HCR, City with Refugees. En voyant la liste par exemple des villes qui étaient partie prenante de ce projet, nous étions impressionnés, mais on n'a pas vu sur le terrain des éléments concrets. Donc, on s'est dit qu'il manque certainement ce côté pragmatique. Et c'était l'occasion pour nous de rappeler un peu ça au HCR. Donc, au niveau local, il y a eu cette effervescence qui a permis et qui permet aujourd'hui aux villes de bâtir des alliances avec d'autres acteurs au niveau local, les acteurs de la société civile, les organisations non gouvernementales. Ces échanges sont d'abord basés entre collectivités locales sur les échanges entre les pairs, justement pour permettre les échanges de bonnes pratiques, les solutions qui marchent, pas seulement avec les collectivités locales, mais également avec les associations de défense des migrants, les associations de défense des droits des migrants, pardon, et des droits des réfugiés, mais aussi les associations qui accompagnent les migrants et les organisations internationales dans leurs activités. Donc, ça montre un peu tout ce qui se passe en ce moment au niveau local. Nous avons eu, par exemple, pendant la période de Covid, la ville de Rabat qui a organisé plusieurs ateliers pour faire remonter justement les demandes des migrants qui ont été identifiés, on l'a encore entendu aujourd'hui, qui ont été identifiés comme des populations vulnérables depuis la crise du Covid. Ce qui nous emmène aussi à la deuxième partie. Qu'est-ce que les villes peuvent faire au niveau national? Au niveau national, ce que nous souhaitons mettre en avant, c'est le partenariat à tisser, les liens à tisser avec les organisations non gouvernementales, et les associations, les organisations internationales également, comme l'OIM, l'OHCR, qui ne cessent d'appuyer les villes. Mais nous souhaitons que, à côté de ces acteurs connus et reconnus, que les journalistes aussi complètent la liste dans le partenariat, justement, pour essayer de changer la narrative sur la migration. Cette thématique est devenue très récurrente depuis que les collectivités locales sont rentrées au niveau de la scène internationale pour pouvoir essayer de faire changer la narration autour de la migration. Donc, ce qui doit se mettre en place au niveau national, à l'aide des collectivités locales, c'est aussi et surtout le plaidoyer pour faire changer le cadre légal, pour donner beaucoup plus aux collectivités territoriales des moyens pour pouvoir agir de manière pertinente sur le droit des migrants afin que les migrants, par exemple, puissent avoir accès au travail, à l'éducation, mais surtout la question principale, c'est la question de la légalité, c'est-à-dire l'accès à la régularisation. Parce qu'on sait que pour l'intégration, et c'est ce que les villes souhaitent actuellement faire, intégrer les migrants. Pour l'intégration des migrants, hormis le cadre légal, c'est-à-dire la régularisation, l'intégration doit se passer par deux choses, l'accès au travail et l'accès à l'éducation. Après, on sait que le potentiel de ville permet d'absorber la migration et donc de faire moins peser les problèmes migratoires sur la ville. Ça me fait penser à ce qui s'est passé en 2019, l'incendie du camp de migrants du HCR à Agadez. Donc, vous voyez que dans une ville, cela n'aurait pas été possible. C'est pour ça que les collectivités locales luttent aussi contre les camps de réfugiés, disons les hotspots, ce qui a été souligné maintes fois lors de ces travaux que nous avons. L'autre point, c'est au niveau international. On a vu que, comme on vous a dit, les collectivités locales ont fait irruption, en fait, sur un champ qui ne les concerne pas, à savoir le champ international, où les États, dans la migration, sont les principaux acteurs et preneurs de décisions. Les collectivités locales ont réussi à rentrer dans des lieux qui étaient fermés, comme le sommet Europe-Afrique, ou bien le Forum mondial pour les réfugiés en 2019 ou le Forum mondial en 2020, où elles ont critiqué ouvertement les stratégies unilatérales européennes qui étaient basées sur les aspects sécuritaires, qui demandaient, disons, le renforcement, par exemple, des mesures sécuritaires, le refoulement en Méditerranée ou bien la création de hotspots sur les sols africains. Les collectivités locales ont montré leur opposition à ça. Mais aussi, une deuxième chose, au niveau international, ce que les collectivités locales mettent en avant, c'est la coopération, parce que nous avons besoin, surtout sur cette question de migration, de la coopération. C'est quasiment le seul moyen pour elles de pallier à leur insuffisance en termes de l'égalité d'action. C'est-à-dire, grâce au partenariat, par exemple, avec le HCR, plusieurs activités peuvent naître, plusieurs opportunités d'action peuvent apparaître pour les collectivités locales et donc pour les migrants et pour leur intégration dans la ville. Ce qui nous amène à formuler également les recommandations que nous avons pour vous, que nous avons choisies, Yanina et moi, et aussi au nom de nos institutions. La première, nous souhaitons que les autorités locales adhèrent massivement à la charte promue par CGLU Afrique, la charte des collectivités territoriales d'Afrique sur la migration. C'est-à-dire qu'elles s'en servent comme un outil pour promouvoir les droits des migrants et défendre les droits des migrants. La deuxième chose, nous souhaitons que le HCR et les autres organisations internationales, mais aussi la société civile se servent de cet outil que les villes ont promu, y compris aussi celui du HCR, Right to City to Migrant, utilise la charte comme un instrument de plaidoyer pour pouvoir essayer de faire bouger les lignes, afin qu'on aille de l'avant dans le renforcement du cadre de protection des migrants. Le troisième point, ce serait d'intensifier la coopération directe pour pouvoir étudier comment les organisations internationales peuvent aider les collectivités locales à à renforcer leurs capacités dans les stratégies, dans l'élaboration des stratégies locales pour la protection des migrants, avec des réflexions, par exemple, des réflexions pour des solutions durables sur l'intégration des migrants par le travail, par des formations et l'accès à l'éducation, l'accès aux soins. Comme on a vu des villes qui se sont battues pour faciliter l'accès des migrants et d'associations des migrants à des kits de soins, à des formations pratiques qui seront utiles aussi pour les migrants. Et je laisse Yanina poursuivre pour la suite des recommandations. Merci. Yanina, over to you.
Merci, Lionel. And just to add to the last point that Leonel was making, for us it's really interesting to see that there's an emerging change of perspective that we see with international actors. While for a long time, the question was really how could cities support international and national actors in implementing international agreements. We see, and we would really encourage international actors to ask more and more, how can we, from the international level, with the international agreements agreed by states, how can we support local authorities, local NGOs, refugee and migrant-led organizations in developing and implementing local strategies for sustainable solutions. Passing on to the intra-regional level, we would really encourage the European and the African Union to ensure that local authorities are included in inter-regional deliberations on mixed movements. And this goes both for city-to-city exchanges, but also for institutionalization of municipal participation in the EU-AU summits, but also regarding other intergovernmental processes. And we're thinking here, for example, of the Rabat process, of the Khartoum process. And finally, we would encourage UNHCR researchers, so all of us, and civil society to continue and to strengthen launching partnerships with African and European local authorities to advocate and pilot complementary pathways, such as private sponsorship schemes. And yeah, we're really looking forward to your feedback, to your questions, and to the debate, and hope that we can jointly develop some of these ideas further together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, colleagues, for that really, really interesting presentation. We will get back to that in just a short moment. If I can just now, I'm also having a problem with my buttons, it seems. Yes, if I can also now just get back to the last panelist for today. We're back now to Georgia, Dr. Georgia Cole. So just to know if the technical problems have been sorted out. Hopefully, yes.
I think they have been. So thank you very much to Jim, and thanks to Lionel and Janina for being flexible.
Yes, indeed. And so thank you, colleagues, for the last presentation. Wonderful. And over to you, Georgia.
Great. Thanks, Eddie. Yeah, so I'm going to start by giving you an example of the stories that inform the title of my presentation, which is on policy regions and migration routes. Where is the alignment and misalignment? And the story I'm going to start with is that of Waldeshire, which isn't his real name, but which he told to me this time last year in Uganda. So first, or change slides, please. Next slide. So Waldeshire had supported the regime that is now in power in Eritrea during the country's long liberation struggle. And on the left is an iconic picture of that period. But when the border conflict broke out between Eritrea and Ethiopia in 1998, Waldeshire was opposed to this. And this was a conflict that caused this kind of destruction shown in the picture on the right. His opposition to the conflict at the time was public during a period where there was slightly more space for public debate in Eritrea, though it still wasn't safe. And so, and there was no opportunity, like there is now, also no opportunity for conscientious objection. So Waldeshire therefore began to plan to leave the country. Sudan presented the easiest option, being geographically proximate, obviously, to Eritrea, but he was worried that the country's ruling party's apparatus stretched seamlessly across the border, and thus refugee camps in Kassala and along that border region would prove unsafe. Next slide, please. He instead then travelled to Massawa, a city on Eritrea's Red Sea coast, and boarded a boat heading for Saudi Arabia via Yemen. And in telling his story, Waldeshire really stressed that it was unexceptional for two reasons, that this move to Saudi Arabia was unexceptional, that is. The first is that his story paralleled earlier large-scale movements of Eritreans to Saudi Arabia. And of the people that we were speaking to in Uganda and that I've spoken to in London as well and across the globe, they've spoken about how decades earlier they had fled to Yemen by sea, stopping there before traveling either overland or by boat to Jeddah or Riyadh in order to avoid being conscripted into the Eritrean army during the struggle against the Derg. We also spoke to people who had been called from the refugee camps around Kassala to join family members who had travelled there and already established themselves in Jeddah or Riyadh primarily during the 70s and 80s. So this was an escape mechanism that had been supporting Eritreans for decades. The second way that this was unexceptional is that Waldeshire recalled how in 1998 there were boatloads of people going every day from Massawa across to Yemen. These were young men who were escaping fighting and the lack of an opportunity to object to that, who were opposed to the government strategy for the war. Next slide, please. Upon arriving in Jeddah, Waldeshire then remembered just how quickly the population of Eritreans there grew in the 2000s. Individuals from refugee camps in Sudan who were desperate to begin earning money to support their families, and obviously who had the capacity to fund their journeys, were moving, he says, in large numbers to the Gulf, and the Eritrean community there was swelling. Can we go back a slide, please? So Waldeshire, like others we spoke to, then recounted how the first 10 to 15 years in the Gulf obviously weren't easy, but that things were okay. This is from roughly 2000 to the early 2010s. If people had work, which most people did until this more draconian set of taxes was introduced by the Saudi government over the last couple of years, people could build and support families in Saudi and often afford to send at least some remittances either back to their family members within Eritrea or to individuals scattered more broadly than that. And none of the interviewees that we spoke to had wished to stay forever in Saudi Arabia. There's institutionalized discrimination, obviously. There are restrictions on practicing Christianity. Waldeshire had a Sudanese ID, so he had to change his name, go by a Sudanese name and be a publicly practicing Muslim in order to stay there. There are no legal pathways to citizenship. There's this enormous vulnerability that's caused by the kafala system. And obviously, Laetitia has already commented on some of the enormous human rights problems within Saudi Arabia. Alongside that, the country had nonetheless provided this community with opportunities for employment and for educating their children, because there are schools for Eritreans there run by the embassy, opportunities that were unavailable in camps and cities in Africa. Next slide, please. The problem with Saudi Arabia, though, and that's why Waldeshire was telling me this story from Kampala, which is featured here, was that over the past 10 years in particular, the country has been institutionalizing a set of reforms in line with the Saudization agenda. And measures have included the introduction of several new taxes and various fines that encourage businesses to preferentially employ Saudis. with these additional costs, for the most part, being passed on to employees through a deduction in their wages, life in Saudi Arabia has thus become prohibitively expensive for large swathes of the country's foreign-born workforce. From the Saudi government's perspective, these reforms have really worked on a massive scale, just as they did on Botti. By midway through 2019, the number of foreign workers in Saudi Arabia, for example, had declined by about 20% over the preceding 2.5 years. So that's several million individuals who had left the country. Like others, Botti had hoped to stay in Saudi Arabia until things had changed in Eritrea, knowing that Saudi and Jeddah provided one of the best opportunities for financial economic independence. But with no option to remain in Saudi Arabia because of this change to the immigration regulations and opportunities for employment, he had departed to Uganda, where his wife and children joined him from Eritrea, and where, when I met them, they were debating whether or not to apply for asylum. And he spoke really painfully of all those people like him who were having to leave Saudi Arabia. He said this was a discarded population. And to use his words, we weren't even asking for them to make us Saudi. We just wanted the paperwork and the opportunity to stay and work. And his Eritrean friends from Saudi were now scattered in Uganda, in Sudan and Egypt, particularly those who were practicing Muslims. And I've spoken to people with similar stories as far afield as Malaysia. And while this study focused on Eritreans, the same story can be told for Somalis, Sudanese, and Ethiopians who have sought work in the Gulf in the hundreds of thousands, but who, particularly in the last 5 years, with the intensification of these policies designed in particular to push out those with families, they've been exposed to these much more discriminatory immigration and taxation policies, as well as the mass deportations that we heard about earlier. But their experiences of return following forced departure from the GCC states may entail rounds of further displacement to potentially dangerous situations, or to economies that evidently cannot accommodate them in the regions that they originally left. And these further displacement cycles may resemble the situation of the Eritreans summarized in Botthi's story. In other words, then, regional increases in asylum applicants and migrants from the Horn of Africa within Africa and Europe, like Botti and the other Eritreans I spoke to in Uganda, may indeed relate as much to policy developments in the Gulf as to political developments in their countries of origin or in so-called transit states. And just to give another quick example of this, next slide, please. This graph shows a sudden spike in the number of Eritreans applying for asylum in industrialized countries in 2014. Upon noting this increase, policymakers overwhelmingly responded by looking at conditions within Eritrea, analysing whether something had particularly changed around the national service requirements, around what was happening in Sawa, and asking what changes had occurred there in order to have stimulated this increase in Eritreans on the move. Next slide, please. And the result was that certain significant dynamics that were actually affecting this movement elsewhere were largely overlooked. One was that it was around this period that Israel's anti-migration stance really hardened further, including with the construction of the border wall, and that closed down a migratory route for Eritreans that large numbers of people have been using in order to access employment opportunities within the country. Another was that this was when the conflict in South Sudan began. And this was a country that had hosted large numbers of Eritreans as well, particularly in Juba. And there was a massive increase in the number of individuals applying for asylum in Uganda when the opportunity to move to Juba was foreclosed to this group. So both situations caused a shift in the migratory pathways of Eritreans, including towards Europe. Next slide, please. Here's a map, though, of countries engaged in the Khartoum process. And I know that this is somewhat of a reductive way to look at it. But despite the initiative's primary focus on the trafficking and smuggling of migrants on the route between the Horn of Africa and Europe, this significant interplay between the inter and intra-regional migratory dynamics between the Gulf and the Horn is really rarely discussed as part of this initiative. Fluctuations in demand for smugglers in the Horn of Africa or increases in the number of individuals being trafficked across the continent, nonetheless, as we know, is tied to the availability of other opportunities for intra and interregional migration. And shrinking opportunities for employment in the Gulf clearly will tie into this. Estimates suggest that approximately 300,000 Ethiopians alone were returned to Ethiopia from Saudi Arabia in the 2 years following March 2017. And assuming that their need or desire to migrate doesn't abate upon returning to Ethiopia, this represents a significant population that will seek or be coerced to migrate through the pathways that remain open to them, either back to the Gulf states, noting, of course, that more people are crossing from the Horn of Africa to the Gulf than across the Mediterranean, or that they'll continue to migrate across Africa. And with the official number of Africans in the Gulf standing at 3 million, but undoubtedly being far higher than that, the possible scale of this dynamic shouldn't be underestimated. Without taking these dynamics into account, though, the Khartoum process is left potentially less able to respond to one of the major determinants of increasing demand or susceptibility to trafficking and smuggling. So this situation thus provides a tentative answer to one of the questions that the organisers of this conference posed, which is, to what extent do policy regions correspond with and capture intra and interregional movement patterns and dynamics? By providing one example of how a policy region with a geographical focus on North Africa might be failing to capture a critical determinant of forced migration to the region. It instead highlights the importance of connecting migratory movements within the Red Sea region with both fluctuations in migrant numbers and asylum applications within sub-Saharan Africa, as well as with migration dynamics towards and across the Mediterranean. And that's because obviously these systems are intricately interconnected. Money remitted from senders in the Gulf enables individuals to pay to leave Eritrea or to pay to stay in Uganda, which was something that we identified in interviews. Word of opportunities in the Gulf diverts individuals from refugee camps in the Horn of Africa towards those jobs in places like Riyadh, Jeddah, and Dubai. And changes in policy in the Gulf force individuals back to the Horn to seek asylum there. So final slide, please. And the clues, this is the final slide. And the clues as to what implications this has for policy can be found in existing initiatives. So recognizing the importance of labour markets in the Gulf for individual and national security, as well as these regional migration dynamics, governments in the Horn of Africa have more recently sought to engage with initiatives that seek to strengthen and regularize these pathways. And the Abu Dhabi Dialogue has been one of these, which is a regional consultative process between labour sending states in South Asia and the 6 Gulf countries of destination, which is aimed at, through collaboration, increasing the leverage of states in Asia to improve the conditions for their workers in the Gulf. In recent years, there have been various observers and governments from within Africa who have attended these meetings in the hope of establishing a blueprint for a similar platform of Gulf Africa dialogue on labour migration. And while one goal, or while a big goal of this is obviously to improve conditions for labour migrants who have histories of forced migration within the Horn of Africa, so there's the hope to stress that that these are labour migrants with histories and ongoing experiences of forced migration. the aim is to improve conditions for them, but it's also about finding, enabling states in the Horn not to have to impose wholesale bans on labour migration in response to serious human rights violations in the Gulf, because of a recognition that these are critical pathways for nationals within their countries in order to access employment and capital. So for governments in the Horn, particularly Ethiopia and Kenya, have been more proactive in establishing bilateral dialogues with Gulf states in order to improve protection conditions for their nationals there. Obviously not with enormous positive impacts, as the situation of Ethiopian migrants recently showed. But for these governments, the possible connections between labour migration opportunities to the Gulf and forced migration within and from the Horn of Africa have not been lost, with the strengthening of these initiatives being seen as a way to support migratory strategies that their citizens have been employing for decades. And a quick final point to finish on, if that's okay, Eddie, is that talking to representatives of the African Union who are working on this, such as through the AU, ILO, IOM, ECA joint programme on labour migration governance for development and integration in Africa, they've stressed that these initiatives and policies are designed to enhance the benefits and security of migration. And in that way, they're distinguished from a lot of mechanisms that are designed and being designed to reduce migration. And this includes by focusing importantly on the human rights abuses that are being committed in the Gulf. That can also lead for calls to reduce migration in a way that they argue is counter to the tens or hundreds of thousands of individuals who actually rely on these pathways in order to support themselves and their families. And so they stressed, and this is something that's come out in some other sources, including a paper by Carolyn Schul, that through those discussions, we also need to not downplay individuals' knowledge of the risks that migration entails and the rational and aspirational reasons for why they still migrate. And through focusing on that, fail to focus on efforts that are looking to really improve those migratory pathways in protection-sensitive ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgia. That's really good. Thank you. If I might just, I'm trying to get my Zoom back on screen for some. Bear with me when I. Okay. Right. So hopefully everybody can hear me. Thank you very much, Georgia, for the wonderful presentation. Very, very engaging. What I'm going to do now is, if I could just summarize very briefly Georgia's presentation, which is just right new with you, and the former presentation, before introducing our next speaker, because we're not going to go straight into the questions and answers. We're going to just have a few more key reflections after this. But just to let you know that your questions are in the chat box, are being well recorded, and I will also call on Ayla to help me go through those questions as we proceed. So very quickly, it's very clear that, you know, from George's presentation, that the migration policies both in Saudi and in Israel has had an impact on the migration options that are available to Eritreans. Eritreans who leave their country for protection reasons, Eritreans who would leave their country for socioeconomic reasons over the years. And also the war in South Sudan has impacted on a traditional migration trajectory for those people. It has all culminated in reduced options, and, you know, people who are on the ground out there can see Eritreans on the move in very precarious situations here in Tunisia and in many countries, and they continue. So it's a very interesting observations there just to recognize that these are huge influences on why Eritreans move, as well as the other ones that related to protection reasons and in their country and in the region in particular. It's very interesting to note that yes, the Khartoum process doesn't really treat that in its present focus, doesn't really treat that in a holistic way, and maybe it's something that this forum can recommend moving forward. So thank you very much, George, on that. Going back to the previous presentations on the city paradox the paradox of cities not being involved in the governance of migration and displacement, whereas we all know that the cities, as Janina and sorry, I'm going to get that name back again. Yeah, Nyanza, I'll come back to you. I'm sorry.
Yemen.
Yeah. Okay. So the whole cities, and we're talking about places like, zooming in on Sfax and Tunis and other cities that have been looked at in the study, but basically it's the inclusion of migrants and refugees in city policies and to benefit from migration is a better dividend for countries and for cities than exclusion. That is a clear message. And the Charter of Local and Subnational Governments of African and the governance of African migration. I mean, this is a charter now that is going to be very, very important as an advocacy tool in getting people involved in that and getting local authorities involved through local chapters, through peer learning, and to connecting the dots around this as a potential new partner with new stakeholders in a formally statist sort of ministerial and then international organization approach towards the phenomenon of managing asylum and managing migration, as to taking that down into the municipal level and getting them involved, but legally involved, not just involved in the discussions, but also legally involved. Interesting how that's going to be done. A lot of innovation there to be looked at, but also what can be done at the national level in terms of advocacy, what can be done at the, there was mention of what can cities do, changing the narrative with media, involving the media and other stakeholders, to have the coalitions of the willing, get cities on board, advocate to change the legal frameworks, and then, the inclusion in education and the work has been very important elements. International level, the AU summits, the Global Refugee Forum, the GMF, and the criticizing. There was one there of criticizing, using that platform to criticize the EU approach towards migration hotspots. So massive adherence to the Charter moving forward, and using it as an advocacy base to develop local strategies. I think so these are just summary points on those two presentations. Your questions have been recorded. I'll just now pass over, with your permission, to our next, not formal panelist, but certainly we're waiting with great interest on the key reflections of Miriam Borekba from the European External Action Service. So it's the global the global migration division. So, colleagues, just to start our discussion, if we could go over to Miriam, if you're there, Miriam, to give us your key reflections, please.
Yes. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Eddie. Can you just confirm to me that you can hear and see me?
Loud and clear.
Yes, thank you so much. It wasn't so easy at 9, but I'm very happy to be here with you, and thank you so much and for the privilege to also listen into the results of the research on these various issues related to protection and migration more broadly. I'll start my presentation or my thoughts perhaps by telling you where I come from. I don't have the privilege to be a researcher from that point of view. I come from a different world, which is, so to speak, the foreign ministry of the European institutions, the European External Action Service, which is part of the European Commission under the head of President von der Leyen. We have in recent years developed and increased the number of persons and services that work on migration. And in the broad picture where we are the ones that support our country desk from a very global point of view on migration-related issues. I have personally worked in the last years a lot on the issue of Libya. So what I would like to do here with you is to give you a few reflections about the EU policy. We're very often being put on the spot, as we've been this morning, with a few reflections also on the new pact. Then secondly, I would like to highlight a few elements of the EU policy in Libya, because I think that the presentation that we've heard this morning requires a set of compliments. And then I'll finish with 2 thoughts that I've picked out from the first presenter this morning and the last one on the issue of the holistic approach, but also of the whole of root approach and the importance of that. So let me perhaps start first with a few reflections on what we stand for in terms of migration policy. Now, the EAS tries to promote being a foreign service as such for the European side, what we call in the pact comprehensive, mutually beneficial and tailor-made partnerships on migration with third countries. Speaking about the pact, independently of opinions that some of the members of the European Parliament may have, and you know that there's the entire spectrum of opinions reflected in the European Parliament, I would like to ask you to go back to the text that was issued by the European Commission on the 23rd of September last year and read the part that relates to the external policy. The new pact contains, from an EU internal perspective, a set of new proposals to foster solidarity among EU member states and to have a more efficient migration policy, but also a human and humane approach. As if you look at page 1 of the text, President von der Leyen is being quoted. It's no secret that these issues are being hotly debated among member states, and there's very different opinions in the room. But the pact also sets out a wide range of proposals on the external dimension of the EU's policies in partnership with third countries. And what we stand for is the attempt to develop and strengthen partnerships on migration, which are positive, which are evidence-based, and which are in line with human rights, the protection of international law, and international protection of those individuals who are on the move. And where this morning we've heard individual stories, seeing pictures, and thanks for that. So from that point of view, the EAS tries to put migration as an important element into its foreign policy, but to do so within the overall context and taking into account what is the socio-economic situation in the countries, especially in Northern Africa. And you will have seen that in the last week, we've also issued a communication, the HRVP and the Commission, on a renewed engagement with its southern neighborhood and a big social investment plan for the region. Migration is one of the chapters there. So having said that, what we're seeking is something what is not set of EU interests as such, and I refer you back to the text of the pact, but it is to take account the interests of both sides, of the individuals, the countries of origin, transit, and destination, and bring this into a positive and sustainable long-term migration policy, which goes to the benefit of all. Second, I also would like to highlight that, as mentioned in the pact, we're looking for a comprehensive migration policy. I have to say, having watched this over the years and worked on this, it is easy to pick some of the different, aspects in the pact of the EU's migration policy and to reduce them to issues of return or border management. But again, if you look at the pact and what the EU stands for, and as Commission and EAS, we're also among the biggest donors in terms of development aid and humanitarian aid. Migration policy on our end goes way beyond that. And what we try to put, and is outlined in the pact, is to develop a policy which deals with the entire range of migration-related issues. And that's for first and foremost international protection also. And if you look at the text of the communication, on the external part, the first item that is highlighted is the issue of international protection, and our continued support in this area to UN agencies, but also to the issue of resettlement. And then we will continue as a big donor to address what we call the socioeconomic aspects or the root causes of irregular migration, but it is to work on development aspects related to migration and also improve what is the perspective of, for instance, the youth and other individuals in their home countries, but also in the countries of transit where they find themselves. And to maybe, I could say many things about the pact, but maybe to highlight a few of the elements in very concrete terms. On the last issue, and the issue of protection, going back to the communication text of the pact, you will see that among the 6 proposals that the Commission has set out on for the pact, we have some legal proposals where the Commission has the capacity and the competence to do so, but there's also a recommendation, for instance, on improving resettlement and humanitarian pathways. It also relates to broadening the support that the Commission gives to member states working on resettlement on a voluntary basis, to also include, for instance, church-related activities, community sponsorships, and so on. So from that point of view, related to what we've done in the past of resettlement, there's also an attempt to be much broader, and that relates a bit to the last presentation also about the cities, and merci beaucoup. I think there is an increased attention also from our end to do so. But I would also like to mention and refer you to the text of the pact, where there's a chapter about legal migration. And legal migration, we have proposals that would go into something that we call talent partnerships. Now there we rely a lot on the capacities and the willingness of our EU member states, that the Commission and the HRVP are out there to support, but is an increased offer also on legal migration and opportunities for regular pathways. Having said that, that makes the point that the policy that we have is not only border management, it's not only Sofia and Irini, but it goes beyond that. I think that is 2 general points. What can I say about our policy in Libya? Maybe I'll take you back to when we started historically. Libya remains a huge challenge, and we're very much aware that in the COVID context, the fragility and the vulnerability of migrants and refugees has only increased. But we try also to address this. We have worked since 2017, mainly in parallel, of course, to the creation of Sofia as one of those CSDP, Common Security and Development Policy options, with another set of tools to again make the point that our policy tries to be broad and address the various issues. We have since 2017 and a January communication, again, I invite you to read the text, on the Central Mediterranean route, also looked into wider protection issues and the use of the so-called EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa to use additional funds to support those present in Libya, as we are not. You may know that our delegation and our offices are in Tunis mainly, with only sporadic visits to the countries that are possible. So to use that instrument to support and go into protection of migrants and refugees in Libya. The Trust Fund has until today mobilized 455 million in projects in Libya. That has also come to support what was created in the margins of the EU-AU summit, which was also mentioned by a previous speaker, in terms of a trilateral task force. That task force, at the initiative of the UN, the EU, and the African Union, brought together those three actors, notably also IOM and UNHCR, for the UN to work together, do joint advocacy and act in the country. As immediate humanitarian intervention, I would say we have used trust fund support to increase voluntary return of migrants willing to go back to their home countries with substantive reintegration assistance. And that to date, under this program, more than 54,000 migrants have been able to return to their home countries from Libya. We have supported an emergency evacuation system together with the African Union, who was very active there, to evacuate refugees to Niger and to Rwanda to do refugee status determination there, and from there on to provide them with solutions in terms of resettlement. And there is a number of European member states who are engaged in that. We have then worked on community stabilization also to improve access to basic services. Again, thanks to our funds and with the help of our implementing partners on the ground, which are the UN, the broad range of UN agencies who are there, but also NGOs, some of our member states' development agencies. And I could, for instance, mention that with these programs, over 4 million people have received improved access to basic services. We have worked on formal and informal education for children in Libya, and that includes both Libyan children and children of migrants and refugees. We've worked in the medical sector, and we have also more recently in this way reorientated some of our funds to have a broader package of 60 million now to address the very difficult COVID situation in Libya. I'm saying that because, and I would like to make the point that from the 455 million in projects in Libya, more than 55% go actually into funding protection-related activities, 35% of these to community stabilization, and 13% on border management. I think that is important to say, that it is not only Irini Sofia, but that we have an important set of projects where we fund and where we try to improve the situation on migration broadly in Libya. Having mentioned the trilateral task force, I also have to mention that we work more broadly politically on advocacy issues, and the issue of ending the arbitrary detention of migrants in the country is one of our advocacy issues. Improving protection and the work and access also of humanitarian aid workers, of agencies in the country, has been one of our elements of advocacy on putting forward a broader migration policy in line with human rights and international law in Libya. I'd mention that in February 2018, there was a major mission of the UN, the AU, and the African Union out to Libya to discuss these matters with the authorities. Now, with the increasing of the conflict, unfortunately, I have to say this type of broader dialogue and advocacy was interrupted, was more difficult. But we're at the moment trying to revive what we call the Post-Jura Advocacy Forum, which brought together all the stakeholders, the wider family of those active and supportive to Libya, into a wider dialogue. We're really hoping that the political process in the country could bring us to a unified executive, a political solution for the country, which would also then make it easier to have a better context to work on migration and do this type of advocacy with Libya, which remains as secret, still very challenging in the current context. Now that to give you a bit of a wider picture of what we do, because I felt compelled to say that our policy is much broader, and in terms of evidence-based policy, I think we also have to look into these broader efforts. Now, last two thoughts, coming back to the issue of the holistic approach, which was one of the first issues mentioned this morning. The issue of the holistic approach indeed remains a challenge. And how do you foster a framework that is conducive to the protection of refugees in countries that face these challenges, and do so in a balanced way? I think this is an issue that we have tackled a lot. We have found the Libyan authorities responsive on some of the issues, but the protection matters and the dialogue in the specific area, for instance, has always been more difficult. Similar issues could be said and perhaps about other countries. I'll just take the Libyan example because it's the one I know best. And how do you make sure that within the different aspects and the interests that are out there in the migration field, we make sure that protection matters are holistically part of this policy, and that the balance is right? And I have to say that it remains a challenge, and I think it has to be a continued effort that these issues are brought up regularly also by us in the political dialogue and that we have with the countries, beyond interventions that would remain strictly humanitarian. So there was the first point between, immediate intervention and broader framework, I found was rather compelling this morning. Now, the last example also of the Khartoum process. We certainly work through bilateral support programs, bilateral discussions with bilateral partnerships with partner countries at the EU level. And that's perhaps the easier part, how to combine and make the connection to find a really whole of the root approach, I think is an issue that we will have to continue to all look into, and that we take the element or the starting point, we take it from the horn, for instance, as was mentioned, or further down, and then we take the policy consequences and adapt our actions. To do this, take into account the entire route up to the EU, I think, is something that we need to further look into and pay increased attention. We have mentioned this very often, the importance of the whole of route approach, but again, I think the research community out there is certainly very fit to also look into recommendations how to do this in a way that is done sustainably, that is done in a way that we can sort of see the thread going in a logical sequence through all our actions and highlight some of the best practices. So thank you for highlighting the issue. I think we're all out there, and I think these discussions that we have, and thank you again to UNHCR and the Mixed Migration Policy Center, I think, to putting all these issues on the table, and we're very receptive to any of the best practices that are being put forward. Thank you so much from my side. Over.
Thank you very much, Miriam. That was very comprehensive and clear. I think your points are well noted. On the last one, very interesting about the Khartoum process and how we can try and integrate among the many other points you made. That one is particularly engaging because it takes the whole of root and see what we can do. So that's going to be interesting as we move forward. We have 30 minutes left, less in fact. So I think we probably spilled over a little bit in our deliberations so far, but it has been super interesting, and I think it has added to the overall value of this session. If I could ask maybe Ayla, if we can now take a series of questions, I would ask Ayla to come in and just ask the first question to one of the panelists, and then I will follow up immediately. So question and response, if we can do that now for the next while. Go ahead, Ayla, please.
Thank you, Eddie. We've actually had a number of questions come in, and the panelists have been great in responding to them already directly through the chat. So I'll just briefly summarize that we had one question from Hanan Mansour about the fact that confinement imposed new restrictions, which worsen the existing vulnerabilities of refugees and migrants, and how can these risks be mitigated in a context characterized by increasing anti-migrant sentiment and xenophobia, which is something that's been raised a few times today. And Jim from the Mixed Migration Center responded with some examples from Tunisia, from Tunis municipalities actually, of programs that they've done that are inclusive, not just for national residents, but for refugee and migrant residents. We also had a question come in on assistance brought from local Libyan communities for refugees and migrants in Libya as a tie-in from discussions about a lot of local-led initiatives and solidarity in other contexts that we've had today. And that was also addressed in the chat. So I would suggest if there are any new comments that we can please invite the panelists to raise them. Over.
Yeah. So, Kale, so open to the floor. Anybody with a question, please raise your hand or just speak. Don't see any hands yet. Maybe if I can start with a question, therefore, I mean, on the cities paper, and if I can go back to this time, so it's Janina and Lionel. Excuse me, Lionel, for being for not getting your name right last time. In terms of your partnerships, you know that the world of humanitarian aid is not a rich one often in some of these countries, and with limited resources, trying to engage, we're already engaging with, let's call them, national institutions and the governments, and we do need to probably continue to do that. Do you see in that context, and in context of partnerships, that it's more of a development type partnership or a humanitarian type partnership? In other words, that other stakeholders could bring resources maybe that the humanitarian community mightn't have. And have you thought about involving those in the charter discussions? Over.
Lena, would you like to start? Or should I? How?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I will respond in French. Voilà. En fait, en termes de partenariat, on peut dire que les choses sont en train de se lancer, parce que si vous imaginez, par exemple, toute l'effervescence qu'il y a en ce moment au nord de l'Afrique, grâce au programme, par exemple, financé par certaines organisations, certaines associations, aujourd'hui, les villes ont pu entamer un dialogue, un débat avec les organisations privées. Je veux dire par là les fondations, par exemple, mais aussi les entreprises privées pour essayer de favoriser l'insertion des migrants dans le monde du travail. Donc ça, c'est une forme de partenariat, c'est une forme de soutien qui viendrait directement aux migrants, parce qu'on sait que les migrants n'ont pas seulement des besoins humanitaires en tant que tels, mais c'est aussi des besoins en termes d'intégration, comme on disait dans nos présentations, c'est-à-dire pour l'accès à la formation, pour pouvoir être indépendant. Donc c'est plutôt ces éléments-là que les villes souhaiteraient mettre en avant, parce que c'est le seul moyen par lequel elles peuvent avancer, elles peuvent donner quelque chose dont elles pourraient bénéficier. Alors que l'approche de l'État, par exemple, va mettre l'accent, par exemple, sur le côté humanitaire. Et le côté humanitaire va demander, par exemple, qu'on finance des camps de migrants, alors que les camps de migrants ne sont pas ce qu'il faut pour les villes. Si Yanina veut compléter, allons-y. Merci.
Yes, thank you, Leona. Well, I think there's actually a lot of humanitarian actors who do very much support migrants and refugees living in cities and having access to services. I think one issue that we often hear, because I'm really happy that you raised the question of how can humanitarian, and by the way, we also hear this from development actors, how can we use our capacities wisely, and how can we reach out to even more actors? We have to talk to a national level because it's their legal competencies, they're the ones responsible. How can we manage to also talk to the cities? And I absolutely see that this is an issue. I think what would be interesting in this regard is to look at cities that try to come together, to speak together, to have common positions, like in UCRG Africa, like in the MC2CM project, to start with those instead of saying, okay, we can't talk to every city in Uganda or every city in Morocco. I completely understand, but maybe start talking with those that would be interested. Because the risk that we see is that very often we hear that international actors that we talk to in our research tell us, well, this or that strategy failed because the local capacities simply weren't there. And while this might often be the case, such reasoning prevents us really from even starting to ask, maybe the strategy wasn't what was really needed on the ground. And I think there is really an opportunity that would make it worth to do this additional outreach to cities, and maybe start with city networks.
Thank you very much, Lionel and Janina. Listen, I think this is an area where I think further discussion is probably needed. There would appear to be a lot of opportunities in how to blend that action that's already there from the humanitarian side with, encouraging the development actors to follow. And I can think of CRRF, I can think of the GCM, the compacts, the two as a forum for that. Can I please thank you very much. Can I please hand the floor over to Fergus Peace, who has his hand up there. I think if I know then it's followed by Ayla and then Hassan Bubakari. Okay, thank you. Fergus, please.
Thank you, Eddie. I have, I guess, not that much of a question, but I just was interested to put in dialogue the presentations from the ACMS researchers on North Africa's COVID-19 response and the Lionel and Janina's work about cities, because we got very clearly from Kuda and Nick the need for kind of concerted regional policy response, but I guess the difficulty of cooperation between North African countries at the national level is a very tough one to solve. So I was interested to hear if Kuda or Nick had any reflections, maybe having heard Janina and Lionel, about how that could happen at the city level, or equally to Lionel and Janina to think about how your reflections on what can be done at the city level could apply to these problems of managing mobility in the pandemic. So to either set, I guess, just to think about the interactions there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Fergus. Over to you, folks.
Hi, I can.
Okay.
Did you want me to speak about the question?
So, Fergus, who is the question addressed to specifically?
Nick is fine, really. Yeah. Nick, Kuda, Yanina, or Leonor, whoever wants to go.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick, please.
Yeah, probably not the best person because I can't actually answer your question, which is great. I wasn't quite sure whether you were referring to sort of city up to the national, or are you talking city to the regional focus? Just to clarify, I wasn't quite sure. I sort of understand what you meant. I just wanted to check.
I guess either, but I was thinking maybe about the possibility for collaboration between cities in different countries in a context where collaboration between the nations is very difficult, and what the potential for that might be.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I don't really have an answer for you. All I was going to say is what the interesting things that we were finding. I mainly did the sort of chapter on Southern Africa, which is probably not as helpful for you either. But what we found quite interesting was, like at the municipality level, when there was a change of sort of political party, NGOs, civil society, and UN agencies found there was much better collaboration and more openness at the city level to work with the inclusion of migrants and refugees than previously. But we didn't really, in the sort of scope that we had, get to the level where you're talking about, which is a fascinating. Like, we didn't really get to cities talking to each other. We found that it was much more of a sort of cities trying to cope, and then at the state level and sort of UN aid agencies sort of talking between them. Kuda, I don't know if you, in your research on North Africa, came up with anything more concrete for Fergus.
No, thanks a lot. I mean, again, it's just to maybe reiterate the point that Nick is making. Maybe it's really a question of tracing certain aspects of sort of local forms of solidarity. And in some of the interviews, the participants did mention the issues around how we shouldn't simply maybe talk about sort of a single narrative of discrimination because of what happens at local level, where there are some communities who are in some ways incorporating migrants in different ways and building different forms of community level solidarity. So yeah, I do agree that there is a lot, not only at the North African context, but we also find it in various sort of African cities, particularly to go back to the Southern African region, where for example, in border communities, we find spaces where there's a lot of incorporation happening. I think with the reference to also the crisis currently at the Ethiopian Sudan border, I think there's also a piece that I also came across where they talk about how local communities are in some ways incorporating and helping out people who are moving from the current crisis that's happening there. So it is really about looking at particular spaces and particular opportunities, and I'm more comfortable to talk perhaps about some of these things happening at in some of these border areas than particularly to reference cities, because I really don't have that much of an insight on that. But certainly, what happens at the local level really makes us question where we should be directing our efforts for policy and advocacy. There's also this loose faith in sort of national government responses and also regional responses. So maybe it also it is a challenge to take a step back from some of these normative assumptions about where change should actually happen, or where change is actually happening. I think it raises an interesting discussion there.
Okay, folks, Fergus, I think I won't pass the baton to unless Janina, do you want to say something quickly on that? Go ahead. Yeah. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add from perspective also looking into city diplomacy, into city networks, what we've seen in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic was actually really interesting regarding practical support, transnational practical support between cities, but also regarding advocacy. So city networks like the Mayor's Migration Council, C40, they came really super quickly up with using their online platforms to share good practice to support city officials in implementing migration-sensitive, refugee-sensitive COVID-19 strategies, to help them to develop narratives at a local level, but also really to connect them with funding at the international level. And then when it comes to advocacy, we've seen with some African cities, but also a lot with European cities, that in this context of COVID-19, they really picked up the Leave No One Behind and from the Agenda 2030, and then also the ideas of the global compacts of responsibility sharing, of whole of society approaches, where they said, okay, now in the context of COVID-19, this is really where we absolutely need that. And they called upon national governments, referencing these international agreements when they asked for more support, also to be able to protect all of their residents, not just citizens.
Okay, thank you. But so just one last time, any magic to offer on the North African city question there that Fergus was trying to deblock? I mean, how can cities and Sfax talk to Rabat, for instance, or how does that work, or can it work?
Well, they do. For example, in the context of the Mediterranean city-to-city migration project, or they do in the context of UCLG Africa. One of the projects that Lionel mentioned in the presentation Lionel, can you say a word on the cooperation between Oujda and Madrid and Rabat with IOM?
Yes, the project is about to create, I will speak in French. En fait, le projet vise à mettre en place à Oujda et à Rabat, par exemple, des structures de coopération et de partage entre les autorités locales et les différents acteurs locaux. Ça se passe à Rabat, mais grâce aux moyens, par exemple, au projet MC2CM, on invite aux différents ateliers la ville de Sousse, par exemple, de Tunisie. En fait, c'est les plus actives. Celles qui sont vraiment intéressées par les questions d'immigration prennent part aux réunions des autres pour pouvoir s'inspirer des solutions qui marchent et les dupliquer, les rapporter dans d'autres villes où il y a la même question de la migration. Et justement, puisqu'on parle de la route de la Méditerranée, la plupart des villes impliquées dans les questions et dans les activités de CGLUA bénéficient de ces expériences emmenées par des villes qui ont accès, par exemple, au financement de l'OIM pour le projet dont je vous parlais, qui a été fait en fait seulement pour cette période Covid. Donc, les pratiques sont en train de se mettre en place et seront en train d'être dupliquées au-delà du Maroc.
Excellent. Merci beaucoup, Lionel. Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. That's over to Ayla, please.
Thank you very much, Eddie. So just a final comment, because I realize we're just about at time, is I wanted to say I really appreciated the perspective that Georgia brought, pushing us to think outside of our normal ways of thinking, or normal country or regional context. And it made me also remember that we've seen actually in recent years an increase in West African migration, West African refugees and migrants in Khartoum, and this was not to be reductive about it, but it's related to, or it's shaped by the decreasing viability of Libya as a destination because of that major corridor that it represented for movement. And so we see Sudan facing these similar questions that Georgia raised. So I just wanted to flag that, and also her point about these transnational networks of care really connected to the city point and solidarity networks. And then a final comment is that we do have examples of cities taking on, let's say, more political competencies. An example that comes to mind is the ICORN network and cities as spaces of sanctuary where people don't necessarily have to enter the humanitarian sphere and claim refugee status, but they can be hosted by a city for a period of time whilst they seek refuge. And on the point raised by Vincent in the chat about tertiary education, I see a lot of overlaps between cities and universities as spaces of refuge and sanctuary, and in these alternative, what Georgia and I have called also emic forms of protection that they offer refugees and migrants who might not want to claim a formal status, but nevertheless look to these other spaces to gain protection, and something that's come up in my research. So just to make those final comments. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very, very much, Ayla, for that's all of those points. As you say, we're getting very close to the end. If I can just call on our last question holder, Hassan Boubakari. Hassan, are you online? Can you?
Yes, of course. Good morning. Good morning. Just it will be very shortly and quickly. I thank all the thank for the panelists of this morning, the Nicholas, Janina, Leonel, and Amira, and just yes, and just to ask them. Perhaps they cannot answer because we are at the end of the session, but what are the feedbacks coming from the migrants communities faced during the crisis to the efforts, the actions of perhaps the national authority, and mainly of coming from local communities and local authorities, I mean municipalities, because you spoke a lot this morning about and you told us about cities and NGOs, local, but we don't have the feedback of the how the local how the migrants communities and migrants groups evaluate and how they gain, how they receive, how they feel the effort of these coming from the different stakeholders on the floor, on the ground. Perhaps you don't have enough time to answer this, but it can be a question also to evaluate the action of the different stakeholders on the ground. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Ayla, do we have time for a response?
I would say we should carry any responses over to the next panel, so we give people some time for lunch before we come together.
All right. So maybe I'd just like to thank maybe our panelists before handing you the floor, Ayla. Just to go back over and name everybody out: Professor Joe Vieri, Nicholas Maple, Kuda Vanyoro, Amara Marcus, Georgia Cole, Janina Sturner, and Lionel Nyamba. Okay, I nearly got that one right. Sorry, Leona. And of course, last but not least, Miriam Bruka, thank you very, very much for your key reflections. Much, much appreciated. So thank you. Back to you, Ayla.
Thank you, Eddie. This marks the end of what's been a really great morning session. So my thanks also to everyone. We have a slight change from the previous day's schedule in that we are coming back at 1 o'clock for panel 5. And that will really represent, again, the moving these points forward that have been raised of how do we then advocate for improved protection responses now that we've identified key recommendations. How do we operationalize them and get them heard? So I really look forward to that next session that will begin at 1. Thank you to everybody.
Cheers. Thank you.